After graduating from high school in his hometown, the young man began to admire life in the big city. It had been 10 years since he left the village, and every morning he took the train, jostled by a crowd of passengers, a job where perseverance would be tested, and one would receive more and more responsibilities. Thus, his time in the office kept increasing, leading him to question why he had such a demanding boss. As a consequence, the young man almost missed the last train, but at least he managed to get home. Even during weekends, which he rarely had free, he lost interest in reading his favorite novel. His monotonous daily life without any change had always been like this. On the other hand, he missed the beautiful and peaceful hometown where he used to live as a child. After sleeping, he woke up the next day in a huge bed and in a child's body. At first, he was in shock and didn't understand what was happening. His hands suddenly became strangely small. Looking out the window, he was startled to realize that the apartment he lived in had turned into a village. As he wondered what was happening, a voice called out his name. Van. It was his personal maid, Till, asking him not to approach the window as it was very dangerous. Though confused, the boy apologized and asked who she was. At that moment, the maid began to whimper in sadness for having been forgotten. Then Van commented on how beautiful the scenery outside was and said he was moved by the beauty of the garden. Till was taken aback to realize that the boy used difficult words and pronounced them fluently, even though he was only 2 years old. On the other hand, the protagonist couldn't accept that he had become so young, even though he had been 30 just a short while ago. Van tried to understand what had happened, as he believed he should have memories of the life that Body lived in this world. Considering the situation, it seemed to be a kind of reincarnation. So the boy decided to confirm his own identity and recall about the personal maid. The full name of this young man was Van Nefertio. Saying it out loud made Till admire how well he had learned to speak, proving the boy's intelligence. He also had older brothers named Mersha, Yard, and Sesto, and despite being able to remember these details, he still didn't know where he was living. Later, the whole family gathered for dinner. The father and head of the family was Marquis Jalpa Pool Ati Fertio, while the first son was Mersha Ilago Fertio. Next was Yard Guy Fertio, and finally, the third son was Yesto Eli Fertio. Not any less important than all those mentioned, there was also Van, and right now, the protagonist was being served by the maids and admired for how cute and intelligent he was for eating without spilling anything. It was like being treated with excessive attention, surrounded by admiring gazes. Although living as a baby has its limitations, he couldn't help but enjoy the attention. On the other hand, Van still had memories of the life he had when he was in Japan. Somehow randomly, he ended up reincarnating in this world. Even though he still didn't understand or feel that it was real, for now, the best thing to do was to get used to the situation. Suddenly, the voice of the family head broke in at the table and called for Yard, asking what he had learned that day. The son stammered that he learned about fire magic and battle formations. It was an intense question, perhaps too much for a 10-year-old child. However, Jalpa continued the interrogation about the day's activities, which meant it was like a daily routine in the house. Van wondered if it was customary among the nobility to distance children from one another. In the morning, they did nothing, and then in the afternoon, they learned sword techniques and were educated according to their age. When asked about what he had been doing, Sesto proudly replied that he had learned magic. Normally, the interrogation didn't reach Van, but suddenly his father decided to direct his attention towards him. Without hesitation, the protagonist said that since he didn't know anything, he would first like to study the history and culture of this country. These words shocked everyone at the table, who stared at him in disbelief. Then, Jalpa laughed loudly and mentioned that since he was the last child left by his wife, he thought the youngest would be spoiled. However, now he understood that even though he was only 2 years old, he was actually a very intelligent baby. There was no doubt that he would develop strong fire magic in the future, just like his parents. The age ceremony when Van turned 5 was something the chief was eager to see, as it was the moment when his abilities would be evaluated. In a world full of magic, it was important to know what aptitude one possessed. There were 2 types of them, the first being the classic 4 elements involving fire, water, air, and earth, which were dedicated to the attack and protection of the residents. At the same time, there was the power to heal, and those unable to use magic suffered humiliations. Everyone in the family there was compatible with the 4 magical types, and Van personally didn't care which type of element he would be close to. The Fertio were nobles specialized in military power and took great pride in it. This world should have a civilization that was developing at the level of the classic medieval and modern. However, as magic made things easier, if there were a spread of gunpowder, the circumstances would become quite serious. This world has 3 continents and numerous islands where the existing weapons were all general and generic like swords, spears, bows, and arrows. At the moment, Van lives south of Grant in a kingdom called Scuderia. The royal family has existed for 300 years and constantly expands the territory, leading nobles with great fighting power and attacking every small country possible. While studying the history and geography of the world, Van wonders if there was only one port for ships to sail. And Till agrees because if they pass through the deep sea, there is a risk of being attacked by giant monsters. The idea of legendary creatures like this excites him. Besides humans, there were various other races such as dwarves and beasts, but since they built their own culture in the field, it was rare to see them. Another maid mentions that Till's words were hard for a child to understand, and another woman suggests the protagonist take a nap, but he replies that he is fine for now, just quite curious to know more. The boy even suggests that the maids might be tired of teaching him, and they respond that it's fine, although they are somewhat shocked by his proactivity. Van asks about magical equipment, discovering that there are stones, minerals, and crystals that can store power. Amidst the studies, the word Prodigy spread among the mansion's servants. It was unbelievable that a baby just 2 years old could show concern and dedicate so much time to learning. The butler Esparta knew how unusual it was to learn letters and numbers easily at this age and questioned Van about it. This man had worked for several years serving Jalpa, but this was the first time the two interacted. Not only was this servant direct to the point in wanting to know exactly what the protagonist remembered, but he also had a rather scary face. The boy stammers that he still doesn't know how to write and perhaps only knows a little addition and subtraction. There was such an intense silence that the protagonist feared the butler's reaction to this information. Then, he shows the numbers 2 and 3 using his fingers and asks what the result is when adding them. Next, he does the same using larger values and tests how much the boy knows about subtraction. After Van answers correctly and another long silence follows, Esparta decides that he would teach him personally twice a week as a new tutor. But little did the protagonist know that this routine would become a true hell. It was not something a normal child could endure, and the teaching material was so extensive that it would become the trauma of an adult. The butler hardly changed his expression, but he was still capable of teaching well. As a result, Van became able to read and write very well, and soon 2 years passed since life began in this other world. Later, he also came to practice fencing and was praised for having good reflexes. It was quite fun to learn the art of the sword, and it made him feel like he was improving every day. On the other hand, Till used to tease him a bit and even made him lose on purpose by catching him off guard. At least there were other maids to reprimand her for her irresponsible behavior. In fact, Van didn't mind and didn't want to punish her for it. Although he said this, the maids explained that rude acts and disrespect of nobility could be treated as serious crimes. Faced with this insistence, the boy flicked Till on the forehead and decided that was enough of a lesson for now. Upon turning 5 years old, the protagonist would be able to fight and defend himself, equaling the older apprentices known as young warriors. He used to learn judo at school in his old world, and as a result, began to love martial arts. The rule to achieve victory was quite simple. All he had to do was hit the opponent first with a stick to win. Unexpectedly, the boy was able to delve quite deeply into this as the battles were interesting. Karate uses the opponent's movement while taking a pause to deliver a precise strike. In this case, Van would use the techniques he learned in the previous world to apply in fencing. At the moment, his opponent has a tall body with long arms and legs. When swinging the staff, he would attack from farther away, making the situation more difficult for the protagonist. Since his adversaries were children, their attacks were always monotonous and lacked any skill or experience to apply in combat. Using the 30 years he lived in the previous life, the boy began to win battles and became a point of admiration for others. Unlike his brothers, Van conversed with those of lower class and was a prodigy that everyone was interested in meeting. Along the way, the vice captain of the night group, D, even approached to ask him something. This man was one of the strongest in the Marquise's residence, so the protagonist decided to listen to him. However, what he wanted was to see the boy's hand, and even confused, Van let him do that. The vice captain observes that the boy's palm was soft and had no peeling skin. At first, D thought he practiced every night, but there was no evidence of that on his fingers. Van explains that he was busy studying most of the time, and when he was free, he usually trained. Then, the man mentions having heard rumors that Esparta issued an order for him to have 3 times more classes than normal. It was a real shock for the protagonist, although it made sense now since he only did this from morning until night without stopping. In light of this complaint, D offers to become the boy's fencing instructor. Seeing how much he loved learning fencing, the vice captain would love to make Van the strongest swordsman in the kingdom. From the look coming from the vice captain, it was obvious these were serious words. Although Van enjoyed learning to use the sword, he also liked spending time studying, and in this case, he would have to learn both things well. Despite D getting frustrated, there was nothing he could do to change the boy's mind. He even promised he would be kind when instructing him, and of course, that was a complete lie. Since then, Van was forced to repeat each exercise about 100 times. Even when he asked to rest, the tutor told him to keep going because they could relax later. When the break time finally arrived, the vice captain had a good idea. While resting seated, they would have enough freedom to do squats as well. All the protagonist could think was that this man was a complete crazy idiot. Despite all the suffering he went through, some voices always appeared to encourage him to keep going. The people cheering for the boy were not just the other fencing students, but also Till, who praised him for working hard every day. Life in that world was tough, but because Van was able to be reborn, every day was fun compared to the tedious routine of the other world. And so, a lot of time passed. However, the boy did not expect that a threat would soon approach to end the calmness of his days. Before this turning point happened, when the protagonist turned 6, he was able to leave home to explore the city. There were various types of people in the streets, and it never tired him to see crowds like that. Van also saw some knights pulling chains with slaves, which took a bit of the smile off his face. Till catches the boy's attention and asks if there is any place he would like to visit. After thinking for a moment, he replies that he would be interested in seeing the market. Apparently, the 12-year-old child soldiers could not defeat Van. The difference in skills was so obvious that everyone called him a prodigy. Being able to master so many different areas made him a genius, and who knows, this way he might be able to surpass his brothers and eventually become the head of the family. The excitement coming from the private maid was not good at all. In politics, the weak were victims of the strong, and those who became leaders had rights to status, honor, and power. Despite having a very promising brother, trying to kill him to avoid any obstacles on the path to glory was quite common within the aristocracy. Unfortunately, Van could not say he had good relations with his own family, and therefore none of them would hesitate to try to kill him. Since he began to stand out too much, he would become the target of others, and at this rate, he would be unable to enjoy a peaceful life. That is why the protagonist asked for some time to stroll and reflect on it, determined to abandon the prodigy time and become just an ordinary child. The idea now was to become a player using the knowledge acquired in the previous life as a base. To achieve this goal, it was necessary to start by understanding how the economy works. As Van walked through the streets, he encountered a large building and discovered it was the Marie Company, which has large branches throughout the kingdom. Suddenly, a voice shouted for everyone to hurry up. This shout was directed at a slave who was being dragged through the streets, catching Van's attention. The man holding her chain exclaimed to the onlookers that this was not a show for them to stare at. At that moment, the protagonist's guards prepared to draw their swords and threatened the individual who had raised his voice. Van raised his hand to make the knight stop and questioned why that girl was tied up. The man retorted that he could do anything he wanted with his own daughter. There was nothing wrong with that since the debt was too large, and he intended to sell her to get money. According to slavery law, there are only 2 types of slaves allowed, which include those traded through accounts and those who were criminals. In the past, poor families used to be sold and used as a cost of living. Using the transaction system, the man would use his daughter for his own benefit. The reason the child was unable to take her eyes off the ground and didn't make a sound even while suffering so much was that she was used to such treatment. And everyone around thought the same, as slavery was quite common in this world. It was such a cruel system that it caused revulsion just to see it in practice. Amidst this tension, a cheerful woman appeared to ask if Van was the Marquis's son. The maid agreed that it was the case, explaining that he was the famous prodigy of the family. Upon hearing this, the girl welcomed him to the Marie Company and offered to show him everything they had prepared. Her name was Rosalie, and she thanked the sponsorship they were receiving from the protagonist's family. As soon as he realized the boy was of noble birth, the man dragging his daughter became tense. This reaction made the protagonist wonder if the man feared being punished for abusing the system. Van then asked Rosalie how much a child like that could cost. She asked the man what the girl's magical ability was and discovered that the child was capable of stealing. Given this, the slave would not be worth more than 3 large silver coins. At that moment, the girl's father became desperate and pointed to a merchant who told him he could get 5 coins or more by selling her. However, no store would buy for less than half the selling price, and it would probably be even cheaper than that. Furious to find this out, the bound child was thrown to the ground and kicked, being called useless for not even being worth good money. Rosalie questioned why he treated her so badly even though she was his own daughter, but he didn't seem to care at all. The two argued, and eventually, the girl's father decided to drag her to another store. However, Van interrupted the conversation and said he would buy her for 5 large silver coins. Everyone fell silent for a moment amidst the tension. Trying to stay calm, the boy felt that if he let that man take the child away, she would end up dying. Till had only brought gold coins with him, so Rosalie offered to exchange the silver value within the Marie Company. After being paid, the man left the girl behind and walked away without a second thought. Then, the protagonist approached to check her condition and introduced himself, helping her to stand up. Although a bit surprised, the child said her name was Kamshin. With that, she was now free and could go wherever she wished. Van's maid was confused as she thought he had bought her as a slave, and the boy replied that was not the case, as he just thought it would be appropriate to help someone in trouble. On the other hand, he understood that now that her father had abandoned her, if left wandering the streets, she could end up getting into more danger. Van asked if there was a place she could go, and as she didn't respond, he suggested taking her to his house since there might be tasks she could do to keep herself occupied. The knights did not believe the Marquise would accept the arrival of an unknown person in the mansion unless he took her as a slave. Reluctantly, the protagonist asked if Kamshin was in favor of this, and she nodded in agreement. Before that, the boy decided to find suitable clothes since from now on they would be together and needed to look good. Before that, Rosalie explained that it was necessary to make a contract with the slave. The two children offered their hands and received on their skins the mark that proves the existence of the bond between them. Since this was Van's first visit, Rosalie decided that the hiring fee would be free. Despite the protagonist expecting a bit of consideration from Kamshin, he sets aside that discomfort and thanks the girl for helping him. These words surprised her for a moment, but she eventually refocused on her work and guided the whole group into the store. They needed to find clothes for the girl, and Van took her by the hand. After searching for a while, the boy found an outfit that seemed appropriate. If placed next to Till, Kamshin wouldn't look strange or stand out in the environment. Rosalie was a bit worried because the fabrics of these clothes were too good for a slave. However, Van didn't intend to treat her that way and wanted the girl to feel good. In the end, he also decided to buy shoes. The first time Van left home, he ended up buying a slave, and although it wasn't expected at first, everything should be fine from then on. As soon as they returned to the mansion, Kamshin was well-dressed and began working as her contractor's assistant. At one point, she went to inform the protagonist that the vice chief was looking for him, but Van was in the middle of a secret snack and even offered one of the cookies he was eating to the slave, asking her not to reveal his location. On the other hand, it was quite possible that Dee had already discovered it on his own by this point. During the conversation, the boy noticed that Kamshin wasn't wearing gloves to hide the slave mark. For her, it was a sign of unity, and instead of hiding it, she felt the urge to show it to the world. The protagonist sighed, somewhat disappointed, and this reaction made the girl quickly put on the gloves to please him. Suddenly, a voice shouted calling for Van, startling him. It was Dee, who was passing through the halls looking for his student and causing quite a commotion. Kamshin stepped out and convinced him that the protagonist wasn't there. However, the vice chief noticed that there were remnants of food in the slave's mouth. At that moment, the girl covered her mouth to clean it and pretended nothing had happened. This clever action made Dee laugh loudly at finding someone who ignored the orders of one of the Marquise's top soldiers, but instead of fury, what he showed was admiration for finding such courage in the slave and proposed to train her as well. Van saw this chaotic scene and could only think it was a shame for Kamshin to have to endure such suffering in his place. However, the protagonist was used to being lazy, and it should be fine to let her take his place for a while. This could be a good way to make the boy lose his prodigy reputation and become just an ordinary child. More time passed, and it was the arrival of Van's 8th birthday. This meant it was time for the magical evaluation ceremony. Being extraordinary since he was a baby, both in studies and in swordsmanship, everyone was eager to see what he could demonstrate. Some even hoped he would become the next feudal lord for always being so friendly with everyone. The children of the Ferdio family were people with compatibility mainly with fire and wind. There was no doubt that Van should affiliate with one of these two. However, among the 4 available elements, it was a shock for everyone to discover that the boy had no affinity with any of them. Instead, creation magic was what he seemed most capable of using. Those who possessed such power were considered the most unfortunate due to its relation to alchemy. It consisted of preparing materials like iron and copper, working with images in the mind to create weapons and accessories. However, it consumed a huge amount of magical power, and as a result, the user always ended up exhausted. It made no sense to expend energy for this when the same could be done by those with affinities in other types of magic. Neither inventors nor blacksmiths need skills for that. To ensure that Van's life wouldn't be a target for his brothers in the struggle for power, he did everything to lower his standing in the last 2 years. There was no way a low rank could affect the competition, and no one would be interested in him. Within the Fertio family, those good at fire or healing were especially valued. Mirka inherited the wind compatibility from their maternal grandmother and worked harder than anyone to secure the chief position in the future. However, this made him despised by the other 2 brothers who were good with flame magic. The result Van achieved must have been the best to reach his goal. However, Jalpa couldn't believe that something like this had happened. The last child left behind by Mira being able to use the creation skill was absurd. The protagonist's mother, who had a fragile body contrasting with the strength of her magical power, passed away, giving birth to him. Because of this, Jalpa had high expectations for his youngest son. From babyhood, he showed a strange talent that made him feel foolish for expecting too much. The situation was now serious enough for the family leader to draw his own sword and point it at Van. The Marquise's family could not be harmed by the birth of someone like that. No one should know the humiliation of that failure. Thus, Jalpa prefers to end Van's life right now by killing him. The protagonist freezes and constantly wonders what he should do to solve this problem. Suddenly, Mersha steps in front of the boy and protects him. He mentions there is an area within the territory he was occupying that was completely unexplored due to its location. There was a remote village there, and it might be a good idea to leave it in Van's charge. About 100 residents live there, and the mountains to the north have quite powerful magical resources. Next to the village lived Count Ferdinand, who was at war with the kingdom of Yerenada. In other words, the village's advantage was that it would rarely be used as a camp for training expeditions by the knights of this other noble. Leaving it in Van's charge would bring no disadvantage and would clear Mercia's hands. Moreover, the new territory still has a bit of loyalty to the Marquise's family. If the youngest son is in charge of the place, even if only in appearance, it would be quite useful. This convinces Jalpa enough, and he decides to leave the protagonist in charge of that region. It was practically an expulsion from home disguised as work. As expected, they at least managed to find some value in Van. As soon as the family head withdrew, the protagonist tries to talk to Mersha. To his surprise, the boy kneels down and apologizes. He was unable to see his little brother struggling and understood what it was like to be mistreated by others for being born a certain way. After giving such an irrational piece of advice, Mersha would understand if Van hated him. But the protagonist did not see things that way and understood that he had been saved. If it weren't for the interruption from his older brother, he would certainly have been killed or perhaps imprisoned. In such a desperate situation, the opportunity he received from Mersha would not be wasted, and that was something the boy could promise. These words move Mersha, who wonders if that boy was truly a genius. With a sharp sensitivity to the hearts of adults, he seems to think about things more deeply than usual. From the beginning, Esparta and Till were happy to report the protagonist's progress and praised him. For now, the Marquise's family would send him to a remote area, and it would certainly be a painful experience to deal with. There wasn't much more Mersha could do to help his little brother, but he would try whatever was possible to support him. Even if it was just a little, as long as it was for Van's sake, everything would surely be fine. The protagonist smiles at his kindness, and they both shake hands. Later, the boy tells his employees what happened, and Till states that even without magic, Van was still a wise and honorable noble. Seeing him expelled to a remote area was an outrageous absurdity. The boy is happy with the concern, but part of him is excited to go to a new place. If he differentiates between the rigid life of the aristocracy and that of the countryside, technically, it was a way to escape the death threat from his other two brothers. In the end, his original desire became a reality. Being a feudal lord of a small village, even if he doesn't speak much, he would certainly have plenty of free time. To start, the idea would be to make the place comfortable and happy enough to live in. Nobles use all kinds of rhetoric to feel proud, but in the end, the priority was always to protect themselves. In the process, they neglect the safety of their own people. In other words, the upper class despises the civilians, especially those known as adventurers. One of them would be working to guard the son of a noble, despite all these problems. It simply wasn't possible to deal with royalty. They were all arrogant and looked down on the commoners. The same applied to the adventurers who served any job that was requested. Despite knowing these details, the young man who accepted the job explains that he did so because it was a request from the Ferdio family and he could not refuse. Later, the adventurers meet Van, who greets them with the biggest smile in the world. That group would accompany him on the journey to the distant village. The boy immediately shows admiration for how strong the team leader seems. He looked like a veteran hero wearing heavy armor. These constant compliments make the adventurer feel embarrassed. The protagonist takes the opportunity to talk to all of them and get closer to know them better. As soon as the boy leaves, the three adventurers are amazed at how lovely and polite that child was. Meanwhile, Van feels relieved because he managed to introduce himself to the escort team. He reads the tips written by Mersha on a piece of paper, asking him to put the luggage on the horse-drawn carriages to keep his little brother safe. He had hired 10 adventurers, and the protagonist is even grateful. At first, they were going to send only one carriage, but Till was determined to accompany him because she worked exclusively for the boy. Few knew about Van's magical differential, but one couldn't stop people from talking about it. As a result, even Dee was prepared to travel alongside the boy to protect him from anyone who stood in the way. Van couldn't believe he was going to be with that crazy guy, and even wanted to request an army escort, but the deputy chief refuses to listen to him. Instead, he sends soldiers Arbs and Lou to go work instead of standing around doing nothing. Besides him, Esparta would also accompany them and was ready to relax in the field. That man had worked alongside Japal for years, and Van imagines it must not be easy to let him go like that. However, from the butler's frightening expression, who was preparing to offer even more intense studies during retirement, the protagonist almost didn't want him to come. Moreover, everyone boarding the journey was carrying so much luggage that it hardly seemed like they were going to a village. Deep down, Van was grateful to have so many individuals by his side to support him. Till is curious to know if something happened to the boy to be smiling so much like that. The protagonist himself didn't even realize he let his emotion show on his face so easily, and finally, he sighs while saying he was happy to see everyone who was accompanying him. In response, the maid proudly comments that among all the other maids, she was the only one allowed to be by his side. Van doesn't understand why this situation feels like a competition, since it would even be nice to be surrounded by servants when needed. Mercia was quite busy and didn't usually talk much with the servants, while Yard and Sesto didn't treat them well. The youngest son was the only different one who took a little of his own time to greet them every day, except for the days when they received gifts and were even helped with tasks. The maids participating in sword training also liked the boy a lot. Knowing this embarrasses him a bit, and he mentions that Kamshin wasn't obliged to accompany him. It seemed that the slavery contract could be altered or cancelled under certain circumstances. But the girl retorts that she had decided to dedicate her life to her master forever. Van turns all red with embarrassment, hearing Kamshin say naturally that she liked him. The carriage they were traveling in doesn't have the royal family crest, because the Marquis wanted to sneak the youngest son out of the city. It was necessary to erase his existence as much as possible. The protagonist had spent a lot of time there in the last 2 years, so leaving made him feel a bit lonely. While looking out the window, he notices someone running and shouting his name. It was the daughter of a guard he had met a few times when he went out for a walk named Yahello. She asks where Van was going and what the reason for his departure was, especially because behind the boy's carriage was another one full of packages and flags that drew a lot of attention. The knight guiding the luggage says they would be sad to let Van leave like a fleeing thief and at least wanted to give a proper farewell. Although the protagonist questions the reason for this, since Jalpa demanded they be discreet, the subordinate laughs and plays dumb as if he had never heard of that order. At the moment, Dee was sleeping in the carriage, and the knight would notify when he woke up. For now, all the soldiers run out with their horses to announce Van's departure. Everyone who notices the commotion waves to him and asks where he is going with great curiosity. Although a bit embarrassed, the boy returned the greetings and just said goodbye to them. He never imagined there would be people who cared so much about his existence. Part of him felt pathetic now, and Van turns to thank those who approached to offer him a handkerchief to wipe his own tears, but Till herself was crying so much that she could hardly contain herself. Later, the group took a break to eat and rest. They would have to pass through 2 cities, and before that, they took the opportunity to set up camp for the first time. In his previous life, Van had the not-so-pleasant experience of living inside a car. This was the first time sleeping in the middle of a forest full of dangerous monsters. 2 groups of adventurers were chosen to accompany him, and the leader's name was Ortho Sheet. He had been working in that field for over 20 years, and was used to interacting with clients. Even in front of a 5-year-old like Van, the man was capable of engaging in decisive dialogue. Seeing this, the protagonist thanks him for taking care of him all this time, and suggests he take some time to rest. However, the adventurer looks at him deeply and leaves the boy confused by this reaction. Instead of explaining the reason, Ortho brushes it aside and walks away. In the meantime, Till approaches with a laugh. She was proud because even adventurers could understand the protagonist's kindness. After leaving the city and crossing 2 towns, Van camped twice. They passed through 4 more large and small places, where they took the opportunity to rest. It was slow progress as they had a lot of luggage being carried. 2 weeks later, they were walking between 50 and 100 kilometers a day. That kingdom was quite vast in Japan. It would be like passing through 3 or 4 prefectures, but part of Van was interested in knowing the true distance of the places. The maid observes the details written on the map and alerts the master that they would soon be arriving at the village. First impressions were important, and so the boy begins to think about how he would introduce himself to the villagers. However, his thoughts are interrupted as the carriage suddenly stops. Then someone announces with a shout that the village is under attack, shocking everyone. The whole group rushes out of the carriage to discuss it, imagining that the invasion could be the fault of bandits or fleeing mercenaries. Ortho warns that anyone who feels weak and contested should step back as he was used to fighting in such situations. The village was surrounded by solid, thick wooden walls, making it quite difficult to use arrows to breach them. In front of the gate, armored troops stand guard, and behind them was an army of mages. The villagers could only take refuge like turtles. Dee tells the protagonist that they should join the fight, as if they work together. They would be able to defeat them. The number of opponents must be around 40 to 50 people, and Van wonders if it was really appropriate to invade without knowing what was happening inside the village. In light of the vice chief's words, the adventurer interrupts and retorts that it was too dangerous to act impulsively. Dee understands his point of view because there would be injuries and even deaths, but those were normal and they should accept that. On the other hand, Ortho responds that they do not accept requests that require sacrifices from their own group members. If they risk the lives of everyone there all the time, then they would have died a long time ago. The knight ignores the adventurer and states that anyone who wants to go to the battlefield now is the right time. The village became Van's first territory, and if there was a crisis, they could not refrain from drawing their swords to help. After all, Ortho acknowledges that Dee was a good soldier, but this situation had nothing to do with them. Even if they paid more, none of it would make sense if they ended up dying along the way. Seeing such determination, the man decides to ask the group of adventurers to escort Van before Ortho could respond. The butler interrupts and refuses because Dee was more than willing to lose his life for others. That knight alone was capable of facing more than 30 people, including an army of mages. If the man dies this time, no one would be able to govern the village. Even if he ends up dying in the process, Esparta was still a mage of 4 elements, and it was exactly in that open area that they would be able to see their fighting power. Ortho is surprised that the old man is capable of fighting and is still willing to prevent the adventurers from taking risks. First, he would build a barrier so that Ortho's group could attack from behind at a distance. When the enemies turned their gaze towards them, Dee and the others would attack from the side, thus increasing their chances of victory. The leader of the adventurers asks if it was impossible to prevent the magical attacks from the opponents, since the only known way was to shoot using arrows. That cart they used during the journey was covered in iron at all vital points, so there would be no problem entering it and fleeing after the surprise attack. Their only objective was to distract the enemy first. Van asks if Esparta would stay behind and face them, and the butler agrees because he would act as bait, the protagonist does. Not like this idea, as the man would certainly die as a result. Esparta was aware of this, but believed it was for the best because at least it would be useful in some way. Seeing the determination of his subordinate, the boy simply says he would like to be the bait in his place. The first to refuse the idea was Till, never allowing her master to put himself in danger. If the boy wanted to help, then she preferred to do the job of drawing the enemy's attention. If they could distract them and she was attacked, they would certainly be able to win. Kamshin agrees, as he also intended to accompany them. Although he hears so many proposals, the protagonist cuts the conversation and reminds them that he was the one in charge. In that case, Ortho and the others would accompany him to the village, and that does not include fighting to save the village. Esparta, who retired from a noble family, contributed too much to the Marquise's family, and therefore dying in a place like that would bring great disgrace. Dee and the other knights were still a squad of great importance serving Van's father, so if something happened to them, he would have to apologize to Jalpa. Till was someone the boy thought of as an older sister for always spending so much time by his side, and he didn't want to see her die. Moreover, he admired Kamshin's honesty, but even though she was his slave, he saw no need for her to take such risks, especially now that she had finally distanced herself from her horrible father and started to enjoy her own life. For the protagonist, who was known as incompetent and was expelled from a noble family, everyone who wanted to follow him were kind and amazing people. Therefore, he could not let them die in vain. Van did not intend to become a leader who only gave orders and never did anything. Being the person in charge, he should put himself on the front line. First, he decides that he would take the cart and the others would advance ahead to attack from the left and right. They should not forget that the shots in the distance were important, so if the enemy did not retreat, they could flee. The protagonist's body could be left behind because, as long as he did not reveal his own identity, the duchy would not worry. Faced with the boy's determination, Ortho lets out a loud sigh and decides that he and the team would risk their lives just this once. If they saw such a young boy saying these things again, the leader would have to reprimand the whole group for being cowards. An adventurer mentions that she has been deceived by nobles in the past, especially by those who only knew how to talk. However, Puriel was happy to see that they found someone like Van who even remembered their names. It was because of this that they would put themselves at risk, and everyone there thought the same way, but the protagonist didn't even have the chance to say that he only remembered the adventurer's name because she was a pretty girl. After all, he didn't know anyone else's identity. On the other hand, the knights serving the Fertio family were also willing to go far. They were determined to protect Van and the future of the nobility with everything they had. After the expulsion was over, Esparta would like the protagonist to also remember the duties of a noble, and above all, he should stay calm because all of this would end in 3 days. Van still thought it was too long, but he did not retort his words. The butler announces that he would modify the area and execute the plan he proposed to create a barrier and attack from a distance. D and the knights would focus on staying on the left, and Ortho and his companions would go to the right. The others would wait there, and if there was any emergency situation, they should prepare to move. With the orders given, everyone runs out and begins to prepare to put the plans into action. The adventurers were still surprised that that old man was so good with magic. It was obvious he was not an ordinary person. They were sure that if Ortho had not accepted Van's request at the time, the boy would have certainly thrown his life away. The leader agrees, believing that no noble so young should die early. In fact, he would even like to have the chance to see him become a lord in the future. In the past few weeks, their impression of the nobility had changed quite a bit. Ortho was very interested in Van and thought that if he saw him in trouble, he would want to help. However, there was much he still did not know about that boy. The lord of a small village would be problematic enough to get involved, and the man almost refused the escort proposal. Living as adventurers, they worked fighting to save the lives not only of civilians, but of everyone who worked under the command of the lord who hired them. Seeing someone like Van propose such an impulsive plan, even at just 8 years old, made him regain a bit of courage to fight. That boy was really strange, but not in a bad way. Meanwhile, Kamshin and Till hold the protagonist in an embrace. Both were relieved to see him well, and Van realizes that those two were like part of his family. After comforting them, he reminds them that they were still in battle and asks them to do whatever is necessary. This included grabbing the medications and medical treatment kits available in the carriages to help the wounded. The bandits invading the village were calm. The neighboring villages and settlements were disintegrating, and gradually the battle would come to an end. It didn't take long for the invaders to realize they were being attacked by arrows, and they became confused by a wall blocking their movement. At that moment, Ortho and D lead their groups to take down the bandits. The leader adventurer was surprised to see how powerful the commander of the knights was, but it was something to be expected from the one who was the vice chief of the Fertio family soldiers. The subordinates worked to prevent the invaders from fleeing to save their own lives. Ortho soon realizes that the current situation was getting bad. The long-range squad couldn't see the enemies approaching because of the wall made of magic. It doesn't take long for him to shout for the others to notice that the opponents were getting closer. However, Puriel was unable to prepare in time and freezes in fear upon seeing a bandit in front of her. She had just used her own magic and needed at least 10 seconds to recover. At this point, she would be unable to defend herself and knew she would die at the hands of that opponent. Suddenly, it was Van and Kamshin who intervened to save her. Although the boy shows a confident smile, the adventurer is worried because the enemy was not someone that children could easily face. Shattering her negative expectations, the two young ones defeat the bandit in a few seconds. The protagonist announces that there is a chance of more attacks and everyone should keep an eye on the front. Puriel just stares at Van and wonders what was wrong with that child to be so brave. Later, the battle comes to an end and some bandits were able to escape, but no one from the squad was hurt. After that, Ortho believes they would finish the request after receiving half of the mission fee. On the other hand, he was interested in staying a bit longer there, and it wasn't just for the money. The other group of adventurers apologizes because they needed to leave to fulfill other responsibilities, and Ortho thanks them for being so helpful. The leader's team would still accompany him, as they were curious to know what the man intended to do. Puriel mentions that she doesn't think Van is the son of a noble, or at least he was far from resembling those she knew. That was why Ortho wanted to stay there to discover what kind of adult a child like that could become. The boy's sharp intelligence was not natural, even though he had been educated as part of the upper class. Van was polite and kind, although he often seemed cheerful and friendly. With no intention of looking down on others, Ortho had never seen a noble like him before, and the other adventurers understood what the leader meant. Before the battle, the boy was willing to put himself at risk for the others, even without any magical power to help. Besides, Puriel was saved when she was cornered and felt she should repay the favor in the future. The mysterious boy was as skilled as other adults they knew. If such a person were to become a lord in the future, Ortho was curious to know the outcome of the territory that would be governed by him. In light of these words, the others were equally interested in supporting Van. Meanwhile, Till was practically begging the protagonist to let Kamshin go ahead from now on. She was frustrated because the boy never listened to her advice and kept putting himself at risk this way. On the other hand, Kamshin realized that she would have to work harder to become even stronger. In the midst of this discussion, Puriel approaches and apologizes for interrupting their moment. She comments with a laugh that Van was so young and already managed to make the girls cry, and the protagonist retorts that he always tries to be sincere with the maid because she was important. In this, the adventurer becomes curious to know if perhaps the boy was an elf because normally children of that race do not age normally, although it was an unusual question. He believes he is human since he has been cared for since he was a baby by his own family. Moreover, he had learned to wield the sword with D to become stronger. The adventurer continues to be interested in knowing if both his intelligence and his worldly knowledge came from Esparta's teachings. Van agrees, despite feeling that part of his mindset seems to have been influenced by Till. Thus, Puriel kneels and says that she was only able to stay alive thanks to the boy's actions and the courage to wield the sword to save her. She was very grateful and never intended to forget what happened on this day. And the boy responds with a smile that it was all right and she could just forget the idea of rewarding him. Before, Puriel always thought it would be a big problem if she ended up getting involved with a noble. However, this was the decisive moment when her heart as an adventurer was won over. Esparta draws Van's attention because there were villagers gathering near the entrance. This would be his first encounter with the people who would be his responsibility from now on. So the boy wanted to make a good impression. As he approached the crowd, the protagonist introduced himself in the most polite and refined manner possible, explaining that he would be managing the village from then on. The elder named Rhonda greeted him, thanking the noble for coming to help them. Van heard that no one from the defense troop had been sent to the village until now, and for that reason, he wanted to apologize. The idea was to protect that place as the new lord, and he was grateful for their understanding and cooperation. The protagonist realized that he had presented himself as a businessman, and suddenly Ortho started to laugh. Although he had witnessed this situation, Rhonda praised the boy for being so polite and invited him to his home. There, the elder recounted how there had been about 150 people in that village 6 months ago. After a month of continuous bandit attacks, only 100 residents remained. The invaders were always different people, which made Van wonder why they were so interested in the village. As the borders of the kingdom of Yareneta were nearby, the border guard knights patrolled under Ferdinand's command. In other words, everything that had been happening in the village was due to the mistakes of the Ferdio family, which left this place unprotected. So, Van apologized, explaining that the former lord had designated a strategy of mages to be placed in each region, but Jalpa had only sent one lieutenant to the big city, so the protagonist didn't know how the situation was in the small villages. In other words, their protection had been compromised as a result. The village's taxes were almost non-existent, and Rhonda didn't believe they were worth protecting. However, Van insisted that they should discuss their future now. It wouldn't help to complain about how the country was, especially when one was angry or depressed. During this speech, the elder's son named Malaga complained that a noble like him would never understand all the pain they had gone through so far. It was clear that he was a powerful man with a great shine in his eyes, but having such a petty personality might not bring any benefit to the village. Van continued saying that nobles indeed have a huge responsibility to correct themselves and the flaws in the laws created by the royalty. Inside, the boy wondered why he was starting to feel scared at this point, and he continued to say that even if he complained about the laws or bureaucracy, nothing would change. In this case, for now, there were 3 things they could do. To begin with, they would have to make this village so valuable that the kingdom could never ignore it. Next, they would have to make money and hire reliable mercenaries to work with them. Finally, they would remodel and develop the village on their own. This was actually the same idea the residents had, but none of these options were easy to implement. Being in a remote area, even if they could sell wood or stone, it would be difficult to make a profit due to high transportation costs. Thanks to the low level of education, no one there could produce high-value crafts. They couldn't make money, and there were no chances of improving life in the village. But now that Van's group had arrived, they would be able to change the situation. The boy acknowledged that it must have been hard for them until now, but they had come to protect them this time. Due to the silence coming from the villager, Esparta asked for permission to speak. He explained that the protagonist was a prodigy who was appointed lord at the mere age of 8 due to the great talent he had since he was a baby. There was also the vice commander of the Knights D to support him, even though he was a somewhat intimidating man. At that moment, Rhonda was shocked, never expecting that such important people had been sent to a remote village like that. It was enough to move Malaga, who began to believe that the nobility was truly trying to help them. He wanted to believe that Van was a strong magic user, but the boy quickly corrected him because he had no combat power. Again, The villager's family was disheartened by the news. But for now, the protagonist intended to focus on reinforcing the wall and keeping the enemies out of the village. The wood seemed sturdy, but it would be useless if bombarded by fire arrows, and the same went for the villagers' houses. Van asks Esparta how long his earth element magic would last, and the butler replies that while active, the cohesion is maintained, but afterward it would turn into regular soil. For now, the boy suggests using this as the base of the wall and placing stones of various sizes on the surface to reinforce it. The idea was to create a trench as well to prevent a surprise attack from enemies, and D quickly volunteers to do this. They should set a trap and catch them so they can attack from above the protective wall. In that case, they would prepare bows, arrows, and also stone slings for the amateurs. Van also asks Rhonda to gather the villagers because he needed to introduce himself and explain the situation. Later, after the boy had told everything he needed to say to the villagers, a great commotion and gossip began among the people. Even so, he would do whatever possible to develop the village. Regardless of being just a child, he had the best officer and the great scholar of the family by his side. Thus, they would be able to take care of the place and make it prosper. At that moment, Van felt a bit foolish speaking, as if he were a politician he would meet in his previous life. Suddenly, a villager approaches asking for permission to speak. He wanted to know how the tax would be defined since it was already difficult enough to pay 30% on hunted items, like monster hides or fangs. In that case, they would lower it to just 10%, and if that was still too expensive, Van offers to pay for now. After all, the quality of life was the most important part. Van knew well that not paying taxes would lead to selling their own children, and of course, they would be too surprised by the reduction in value. Another villager asks if they could get a unit of knights to protect them in case the bandits return, and the protagonist explains that it would take 2 weeks of travel to arrive and another 7 days to make preparations and checks. Due to the great distance, there would be delays, and they might not even arrive. The boy understands their anger, but the kingdom does not have enough people or budget to cover such a large territory. Even if knights arrive, there is a great chance they would be decimated, and there would be few survivors. Even if they form an army, they would need 200 people and money for supplies, weapons, and food. Finally, he asks Esparta to make an earth wall inside the fence, and as soon as the magic begins to manifest, everyone screams in fright. At this point, everyone's cooperation was more important than anything else. So, if they were to live there, the village would grow even more than before. Since there were no accommodations, the group decided to spend some time in the cart and use camping gear. Rhonda tried to offer his house for them to sleep in, but Van didn't want to evict him from his own home. So far, the protagonist was not discouraged by the creation magic he had. Therefore, he did not want to despair or get distracted by unnecessary things. It was pointless to wish to do what the 4 elements could not do. Even giving his best, most of the villagers remained skeptical, and thus the boy would have to work hard to earn their trust from then on. Using the power that Van possessed, he would ensure the village's protection and make it a space full of comfort and happiness. During dinner, the protagonist explains that they could not just protect the village. The ideal was that they could attack without retaliating in kind. Rhonda mentions that he could thrust a spear through a gap in a wooden fence, to which Dee responds that in that case, the enemy would use the same method. Then, the protagonist suggests creating a catapult. However, the butler retorts that they were used only in sieges and not for protection. The villager is confused about what they meant since he had never heard of this weapon. At that moment, Dee explains that it was a device capable of launching stones, but it was very slow and difficult to fire accurately. Then Van comments that if they were throwing several stones, the attack would spread, and if aimed at the invaders at the gates, it would be quite effective. If they could add a gallon of oil and a torch, it would be much more effective. Esparta questions who would be responsible for creating this mechanism. As soon as the boy answers that it would be him, everyone falls silent, somewhat surprised. However, it should have been obvious because Van's creation magic was useless most of the time. At that moment, he was unable to understand his ability, so to master it, he trained intensely on the way to the village. Wood, stone, iron, and other metals could be freely deformed. Van was ready to showcase his ability. The next day, the protagonist went out with the adventurers and asked if it was safe to leave the village now that the bandits had been expelled. Ortho replied that since it was a bit fun, they had been hunting the monsters around for some time to earn money. It didn't take long for them to stop at the location in question. There were traces of creatures nearby, and therefore the adventurers would go ahead, warning Van to stay safe and cut the nearby trees. Ortho's intuition was admirable, as on the journey there, he noticed the nearby monsters before they even appeared. It seems that, although he is a great adventurer, his ranking hasn't risen quickly. Interrupting the protagonist's thoughts, Kamshin pointed out a tree that looked good to cut. Van didn't think it was possible to do this considering how big it was, and the other nearby one was too wide. If he didn't maintain a clear image when using the magic, the result would likely be strange or brittle. The imagination of the smallest details would allow him to create the tiniest of details, and the warmth of the magic moved slowly through his body. As soon as he felt it reach the tips of his fingers, he knew the result needed to be as refined as possible. Paying attention to every grain of wood and trying to twist the fibers to turn them into a rope to strengthen it, it seemed to be yielding good results. If he could knit them into smaller pieces, he would be able to transform them into a block of wood. Although made of wood, it looked quite like plastic, and that was the result of the boy's efforts. Till was impressed even without fully understanding what had been created, and the protagonist explained that it was like a nanofiber, being a box with wood grains. It was much stronger than normal material, and he wanted to create things using it as a base. The processing would be done later, so it would be necessary to take the new creations to the carriage. A little later, the adventurers approached, shocked by the number of blocks they were carrying when they should have been focused on getting wood from the trees. On the other hand, Ortho observed that those strange pieces were lighter and stiffer than expected. He decided to do a resistance test first, and Van agreed as he also wanted to know how strong it could be. The attack was so intense that it made the block fly against a rock, but it didn't break even after that. Till was impressed with how resilient it seemed, just like Ortho, as he had used all his physical strength. Van wondered if stone or wood was harder, and the adventurer replied that it was obviously stone. However, even he wasn't able to break such a hard material. Therefore, those nanofiber blocks were impressive at this point. But even after all that, Van's magical energy hadn't run out. They said it was hard to make things because it was exhausting and required complicated details. Then, the boy began to imagine a weapon of normal size, one that wasn't made of metal but had a blade as sharp as possible, like a katana. The result was a sword that Kamshin admired enough to want to keep as an heirloom. Next, the boy handed the maid an axe, which didn't excite her that much. The protagonist was confused if it was because she didn't like that type of weapon, but he assured her it was one of his most powerful creations. Seeing him somewhat disappointed, Till quickly forced herself to say that she loved axes. Van mentally apologized to her and promised he would make the weapon prettier later. For now, the boy didn't know much about magical consumption, but it didn't seem like his production was that useful. Instead, it could be manipulated in an unexpected way under certain circumstances. It took only half a day for them to build a large wall around the village. Ortho commented on how unique the butler was with a skill capable of activating so many consecutive spells. After being treated like a loser in magic, the protagonist felt happy to be considered equal to Esparta. Puriel felt that the fact he was working as a servant now was strange, since normally such an incredible mage would be in the army. If he were an adventurer, he would rise to the top of the ranks, so it was great to have someone so amazing working on the team. Van would be happy if the golden age of Esparta could be filled with achievements. However, the butler in question mentioned that to become so strong, the boy needed to work hard on his studies as much as possible for a long week. In the end, he was dragged by Esparta while trying to argue that the village should be the priority now. Then, the butler asked how they intended to reinforce the protection of the village, with D excited to stack stones. At that moment, the protagonist wondered if they were all idiots, but he replied that he was thinking of trying something new with his creation magic. This was a true surprise, but they imagined that no one could use this type of skill better than him. The premise was to use the same method of making wooden blocks to strengthen the surroundings of the village. In this case, he would only have to care about the height as the key point to prevent enemy invasions, as the metal doors could be added later. As soon as Van's power begins to manifest and he creates the enormous door, everyone freezes in surprise at that extraordinary creation. Ignoring their surprise, the boy asks Ortho to attack the new construction with the sword to test its resistance. The result is that only a small scratch was left behind, which means that the wood was not the best material. However, all the adventurers nervously explain that this alone was impressive because Ortho's sword attack should have split the target in two. This shower of compliments fills the protagonist with contentment in himself. The next day, he wakes up feeling his body ache and in a place that was not exactly comfortable. The boy feels nauseous because he barely managed to take a shower after all the work he did and could hardly change clothes. Everyone had been traveling in the carriage for a long time, and after arriving in the village they still had to find improvised resting places. On the other hand, the protagonist remembers that he was part of the nobility, and feels that somehow he had been deceiving himself into thinking he was an adventurer. Till and Kamshin greet the boy as soon as they see him wake up in the morning. Those two seemed fine even in this situation, but soon Van realizes that both were actually worse off from so much exhaustion. They had just gotten used to hiding their fatigue well, and it was enough to make the protagonist decide that he wouldn't let this continue any longer. Even before finishing the strengthening of the village's defenses, it was necessary to get food, new clothes, and adequate shelter for everyone. That's why the next objective became to build a house. So, he asked Kamshin to bring those wooden blocks over there. A little later, the elder appears and asks what exactly they were trying to do. Van explains that he intended to make a house and questions if it was alright to use that space. Rhonda says that the place was right in the middle of the village and would be appropriate for the master's mansion. The villagers do not usually use this space as a real square. Seeing the old man's dejected expression, the protagonist thinks that one day he would like to make everyone celebrate harvest festivals and even carnivals. Hopefully, the boy's magical reserve was quite large, so he wonders what the maximum size he could build that house would be. It had to be enough for Till, Kamshin, Esparta, and himself to live in. The place where Dee and the other knights would live would be separate. To start, they created the pillars and then the four sides to determine the size. Imagining, the boy begins to make the structure and forges walls and floor until he finally reaches the roof. Having the blueprint in his head, it seemed larger and more difficult when creating with his own hands. Next, the boy works on the furniture inside each room. Using the wooden blocks, he forges the dining room that would be shared, as well as medium-sized bedrooms. After that, there would be small private rooms for meetings. Otherwise, Esparta would certainly be bothered. Because there was no glass available, he opts to use shutters until they can get sand. The result was a mansion so large that they could barely see the top properly. The butler states that it was small compared to the houses of other nobles, but it was large enough compared to the other houses in the village. Till and Kamshin are amazed by their master's magical creation power, praising him and even mentioning that this type of power was more suited to a lord than the four elements. Van agrees that it is an interesting magic, but believes that offensive skills are the best way to protect a territory. After all, anyone would prefer to live next to a lord who keeps them safe. Till even says he would prefer to live with Van than under Jalpa's charge. And Esparta mentions that in times of war, that was probably the case. However, if there were no enemy threats, the master of the territory should still be able to improve the lives of the residents. In this sense, in the eyes of the people, even Esparta believes that Van stands out quite a bit. The others excitedly exclaim that they would follow the protagonist too, no matter what happens. Quickly changing the subject, the boy tells Dee and the other knights about having created a house using magic, leaving them all frozen in shock. With this in mind, Van believes that if he can get more wood, he would be able to create even more buildings than before, and would offer them to everyone there. At that moment, the soldiers rush out to get the carriages and gather supplies. This was a spirit of excitement that the boy had never seen before. The vice commander orders all his subordinates to head straight to the forest. From the excitement coming from Dee, Van wonders if they all wanted to live so much in that village. Meanwhile, Rhonda and the other villagers approach to discuss the creation of new houses. Everyone comments on the problems they had in their own homes, and it didn't take long for the requests for help to start piling up. Suddenly, this situation became exhausting, and Van thinks that Dee shouldn't have gone around spreading so much information. It was obvious that the homes of those people would be dilapidated considering everything they had been suffering, so as Lord, it was his duty to help. Therefore, he begins to ask those gathered there to line up because he would build a new house for each of them. If the boy's creation magic could bring happiness, then he had no choice but to use it. Thus, Esparta and the others began to work on making the protective wall around the village. Dee, Ortho, and their friends collected wood, and Van took Till and Kamshin with him to prepare the new homes. Gradually, the protagonist begins to get used to the projects and thus becomes capable of producing everything at high speed. In a way, he would like to create the furniture on his own. The feeling of doing what was asked repeatedly was tiring, which reminded him of his days working in a company as an employee. But now that he had committed to these tasks, he couldn't stop, and everyone admired him more than ever. In summary, the houses were being grouped side by side so that wide and standardized streets could be created. The constructions were made using the same quality and materials so that there would be no questions regarding preferences. The villagers were extremely grateful, and every time Van met someone, they immediately bowed and made offerings. Then, the protagonist forged a very simple bathroom next to the Lord's mansion. The idea was just to allow for washing up and being comfortable after a long time working, but all his subordinates were happy. Puriel used water magic to fill the bathtub and complemented it with fire to heat it. In the meantime, she and Till invited Van to bathe together, which completely took him by surprise. The women didn't intend to drag Kamshin along because she was an adult, but the boy was younger and it should be fine. Or so they thought, but none of them knew that inside. Van was an old man and definitely wanted to avoid that situation. But no matter how much he denied it, he ended up being dragged along anyway and deeply regretted it afterward. In any case, after the bath, the boy was finally able to go to a spacious room to sleep. However, Van belatedly realizes that he didn't create furniture for that room and feels sad at the thought of spending the night in sleeping bags. After quickly preparing a bed, He throws himself onto the soft mattress and finally falls asleep. The next day, the boy woke up and had a wonderful breakfast. He hadn't rested so well in long, exhausting days, so it was wonderful to wake up in a bed this time. Enjoying delicious meals in his own home during the morning was a natural event he missed greatly. It made him happy to be able to laugh alongside Till as well. Protecting the village was important, but there were other problems they had to deal with too. Esparta heard that the monthly traveling merchant was the only way to communicate with the outside world. Although he said these things so calmly, the protagonist could see that the butler was eating an omelet with the utmost calmness, as if it were nothing unusual. Van wonders how he would handle so many events at the same time. Finally, he says that he intends to prepare houses, furniture, and clothes, and there would be no conflict related to food, so they should focus on strengthening the village. However, Esparta mentions that they still lack spices and ingredients for creating various dishes, including those sweets that Van liked so much. Hearing this immediately makes him realize that they would have to find products to sell. Kamshin believes that the wooden blocks could be good, and the boy rejects the proposal because he was the only one capable of creating them. Till mentions hunting monsters and collecting materials, and again Van denies it because although Ortho could face the creatures, everything that was caught still belonged to him. Normally, they would have been able to acquire crops in the long term, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to do so in large quantities considering the village's poor characteristics. It was necessary to find a better method to generate money. The next day, an adventurer named Kusara intended to test the weapons created by Van, but neither Kamshin nor Till seemed willing to use them. The protagonist is happy to see that they appreciated the gifts, but the best way to make good use of them was to know their own limits, or they would be unable to protect themselves. Faced with both of their hesitations, the adventurer mentions that it wouldn't be a problem to help them with training. This is because he possessed a knight's shield made of a resistant material that could also be flexible. As soon as Kamshin tries to use her own sword, Kusara understands that the girl didn't want to hurt him, but if she didn't take the practice seriously, then it wouldn't make sense to do this exercise. Until suddenly, out of nowhere, his shield cracks and breaks a piece. Everyone is shocked, especially the adventurer who had just acquired that new shield. It was unbelievable that Kamshin's sword was so strong, even though it was made of wood. In light of Kusara's sadness, Van approaches and restores the shield, strengthening it with a new material. Ortho appears and asks what was happening upon seeing his colleague whining about his own armaments. Upon meeting Van, he realizes it was perfect timing and questions whether he would be interested in buying some ores. At the end of the forest, at the foot of the mountain, they managed to find several formidable monsters. As a result, they were able to collect various ores without needing to enter the mines. There was copper, silver, iron, and even a bit of gold. However, what excited the adventurer the most to show to the Lord was the mithril. Van was impressed that they managed to obtain something of such high quality within the forest. Perhaps it was because it was too far for the population to reach and required an inconvenient path. Only a few knights should have attempted to explore the area. It was a great stroke of luck to have such talented adventurers on the team to discover the existence of these ores and herbs with wood. Magic permeates through the layers easily, but iron had few fragile parts that could be targets. He decides that he would make those vulnerable pieces covered in sand and quickly manages to create a block of iron. Normally, it would be necessary to remove the impurities, so the protagonist couldn't guarantee the quality of the material he had just forged. Kusara gets all excited, asking if the boy would make him a test sword using the new ore. He would love it if it were a thin-bladed one. His reaction leaves Ortho confused because he had never seen him so excited before when it came to weapons, but perhaps it was because Van's creations were valuable. The protagonist decides that he would make something new for each of the adventurers as a reward for obtaining the materials. It would be the first creation of a weapon made of iron. The blade had to be thinner than a katana, but sharp. With that in mind, the boy manages to forge the sword after some time. It hadn't taken long to finish it, and although he barely managed to polish it, he was gradually getting used to his own skills. Van hands the sword to the adventurer and comments that he was his first customer, so he worked hard on the details of it. Kusara lets out a shout of happiness and immediately becomes protective of the new gift. Ignoring him, the boy decides to create something new next that would match the design of that first sword. Thus, the adventurer got the two weapons as he had requested and was quite satisfied. In light of this, the others in Ortho's group began to want new armaments, and Van was surprised that they suddenly had so much interest. Puriel wouldn't be able to assess the value of the boy's creations until they could see them in action, but they should be good enough to be sold for a high price. Interrupting, Esparta mentions that it's rare to hear about ores in forests instead of mountains. Occasionally, there were discussions about iron sand, but the metal itself was rarer. However, if the place where they found it was near a dungeon, there were stories about golem stones that could create this type of material. Ortho asks the group if anyone managed to find remains of that type of monster, but it didn't seem to be the case. They didn't even know if there was really a dungeon in that region because they hadn't been able to investigate properly. Then, Esparta says that if the suspicions are confirmed, their luck could change drastically, as they would get more visitors and valuable goods for the village. A dungeon was a paradise full of resources and treasures. There were various weapons, accessories, and national artifacts that were conquered. That was the reason they were so important. Adventurers need to report to the guild if they find new dungeons, as the rule was always to open a new branch near the nearest city to the location in question. Finding a new dungeon was an incredible achievement in many ways, being a good opportunity to gain fame and fortune as an adventurer. If the village reports to the guild now about the suspicions of that new discovery, there would be the risk of being unable to handle a large number of people visiting the village. The place would be filled not only with adventurers interested in the new dungeon, but also with merchants and knights trying to maintain security and gather resources. There is the possibility of an enemy country attempting to attack, including under the command of Count Ferdinand. Despite all the risks, the group of adventurers was curious to at least take a peek at the dungeon. Puriel agrees because as soon as the guild learns about the discovery, they would send troops immediately and lose the chance to explore it. Van ends up laughing because he was kind of considered a burden to the Ferdio family, so they would try to get rid of him at the first chance they got. Therefore, the best thing to do now was to expand the village before spreading the news of the new dungeon, so that the boys' family couldn't do anything to control them. In a way, the protagonist understands the anxiety of the adventurers and would like to repay them for the kindness they always show. A dungeon was quite important for a noble. Van's family saw him as useless and expected nothing from him, which is why taking the new dungeon for himself now would risk his brothers trying to manipulate him. That's why he feels he should use the power he has in hand now and not let anyone take his territory. For now, Van had finished the project of getting new houses for the residents, so the next step was to focus on finances and provide defense for the place. Although Till praises him for being so proactive, the boy himself ends up getting tired of working alone. It didn't take long for him to consider the idea of hiring new people to help, but few places could offer service. The idea was to create a stock of shields and weapons before the merchants arrived, both for sale and for self-defense. At the same time, the project of building the wall around the village was almost finished. They had managed to gather many stones to make the fortress as strong as concrete. Obviously, all of this was only possible with the use of creation magic. At first, the wall might seem low and thin, but they had thought of a way to get around this small problem. This was because they had prepared ballistae to place above the walls. Additionally, Van took the opportunity to place a shield in front to protect the users from possible attacks. That way, they could fire without fear of being counterattacked. The boy also prepared towers around the village and set up more of these weapons. Till decides to step out to start preparing dinner and would go fetch Kamshin as well. At that moment, the slave appears, and Van praises her for the good work she had done during the day. However, the girl had a rather serious face, and this worries the protagonist. Kamshin had brought some of those construction stones and witnessed the moment when Van transformed the village so easily. This made her feel a bit useless, but the protagonist says he was just doing his job as lord, and therefore she shouldn't feel bad. Instead, he becomes curious to know if Kamshin had a personal goal. Despite having asked this question, Van wonders if it was appropriate to question someone who had barely turned 10. However, the girl immediately responds that her greatest wish was to protect her lord. Van is moved by these words full of determination and asks Kamshin not to overdo the work. That girl was always straightforward and truly showed she cared about the protagonist. This makes him consider that he should prepare a special armor just for her. After all, a knight needed something like that to protect themselves from danger. And so, for the next 3 days, Van continued to work hard to make the village a small stronghold. The result was perfect, and at this point, it should scare off any bandits trying to approach. If only Jalpa were aware of his own son's power, Dee believes the Marquise's family would have become even more vast and impressive than before. Esparta asks the vice commander not to say such things, because the chief considers battle capability the most important part of a leader. Still, Dee believes Jalpa should recognize Van's potential for the future. The two continue to argue with such intensity that it even ends up scaring Kamshin until, finally, the protagonist says that even when living lamenting one's circumstances or lack of skills, there was nothing that could be done to solve that problem. The idea was to say a motivational phrase, but the first thing Dee did was laugh loudly at his words, not out of mockery, but in agreement. After all, complaining wouldn't change anything, and the best they could do now was to move forward. In any case, the previously tense atmosphere had relaxed, and they could return to work. The pit they had managed to dig had not yet been filled with water. They were good for defenses and also had an elegant effect on aesthetics. Staying hydrated was quite important, but it was necessary to fortify the bottom and walls surrounding the water, as well as create an escape route. While the boy was focused on creating an adequate fountain, someone suddenly shouted when a new problem arose. It was a villager who ran in, panicked, saying that the bandits were approaching. They were coming from the other side, and everyone should prepare for the battle that was coming. Van ordered them to raise the bridge and close the gates immediately. He asked if there were other people outside the village in the meantime, and one person volunteered to check. It had only been a few days since he arrived, but it was a surprise for the protagonist that they were following his orders without protest. On the other hand, it was clear that the villagers were afraid to fight. Van couldn't help but feel a bit scared too, but as Lord, he couldn't show weakness and had to motivate everyone. He needed to take responsibility to lead them all. So he spoke to the terrified villagers about the invasion. He understood that they were all afraid after being hurt by bandits for so long. But this would be an important battle for the future of the village, and for the good of all of them, Van stepped onto the battlefield, but he wouldn't be able to win alone. So, he asked everyone to lend him their strength and fight together. Although they were visibly scared, the village warriors announced that they would support him. In light of this display of courage, the Lord thanked them and asked a man named Yash to go to the watchtower. They should prepare at least 5 people per session, and at least 10 to stay at the entrance gate. While the protagonist was running, giving orders, Till suddenly stopped him by grabbing his hand with an intense look. Realizing that the maid hated the idea of seeing him put himself at risk, Van asked Dee to organize the troops to investigate the enemy plans. The vice commander could confidently say about himself how much of a genius and impressive leader he was. Even though he wasn't always in a favorable position or ended up surrounded by adversaries, he certainly managed to achieve victory. It was all a result of his efforts to train high-ranking soldiers, and also choosing the best combat tactics. Dee believed he was capable even better than Commander Straydale, and this side of him was now serving Lord Van. So far that boy had surprised him every day that passed. Therefore, the man believed he could trust him and allow himself to sacrifice for his master if necessary. Laughing loudly all the way, he reached the soldiers and caught their attention. The vice commander analyzed the view they had over the fortress of the approaching bandits in the distance. Now it became clear what kind of invaders they were, but for some reason, they seemed to be running. Dee told Van that there were approximately 50 or 100 of them in number. Apparently, they were coming in the direction of the village and should prepare to defend themselves. The protagonist asked if it was possible that the bandits were running because they were being chased by something or someone. That was a possibility, and the vice commander considered the idea that patrolling knights might be responsible for scaring that approaching group. However, one of the soldiers on the wall shouted upon seeing a tail in the distance. This put Dee on alert, and it didn't take long for them to discover the origin of that strange sight. What was making the bandits run towards the village were 2 enormous armored dragons. This situation was horrible because even experienced knights would have difficulty facing such a creature. Thus, the vice commander informed the Lord about the situation and how it was impossible to attack the monster using common weapons. Magic should be effective, but the only ones capable of fighting would be Esparta and Puriel, but those 2 were busy. Even without a sorcerer, using a large order of armed knights might be enough to take down at least one of the dragons. As long as they could restrict the movements and attack the weak points, avoiding attacks from paws and tails, victory could be achieved. With that, Van shouted to those in the fortress to replace the ballista arrows with those made of iron. Although Dee was almost certain that this type of attack would be useless, he still decided to follow the Lord's orders. The dragons were so large that as they passed, they could be seen from a long distance. Their speed wouldn't be a big problem if the creatures ended up catching one of the men they were pursuing as bait. Van asks if there isn't another way to stop them because he feels bad about hurting them. This makes the vice commander laugh, as he only mentioned it as a joke. When in a complicated situation, it was better to make light comments like that, and Dee knows he needs to relax his shoulders too. In this case, he decides he will draw the monster's attention and take care of them himself. The idea was for them to shoot at the bandits after they fall into the pit. Van asks the men using the ballistae to fire arrows at the dragons as soon as they get closer. Dee assures that there is nothing to worry about because a hit in the mouth or eye should be enough to take them down. None of them would die, and the vice commander was ready to ensure everyone's safety there. With the plan in motion, the bandits running toward the hole end up falling. Those who are left behind are caught squarely by the dragons in a horrific scene. As soon as this happens, everyone attacks with iron arrows, but the task proves more challenging than they expected. Dee soon becomes alarmed when he realizes that some of the attacks miss and barely cause damage. However, one of the creatures ends up falling to the ground, in agony. The reason for this was that one of those iron arrows unexpectedly pierced the monster's scales. As a result, the wound deepened and broke the dragon's paw. Clearly, it wasn't serious enough to kill it. But Dee didn't expect the shot to have such an effect. Immediately, he remarks that Van's creations were impressive. In just one hail of arrows, they managed to kill all 10 dragons. However, they were now out of ammunition and would need to bring more arrows from the stock. The protagonist thinks that if there was nothing left, they should just use those made of wood. Dee relays the orders and happily notices that everyone has regained their spirits after managing to defeat the monsters. The second powerful shot would certainly be even more to the point. Those in the watchtower should be ready for battle, undoubtedly believing they could achieve victory. This was the demonstration of the village's new firepower, capable of killing several dragons at once. To Dee's shock, even the wooden arrows were able to pierce the creature's scales. Although the results were less effective than those made of iron, they still caused considerable damage. Soon he shouts for them to keep attacking relentlessly until the battlefield was secured. As they achieve victory, everyone in the fortress celebrates, as do Van and the villagers watching from a distance. The enemy was destroyed, and there were no injuries. Dee was sure Commander Straightale would never believe what happened there. Such a result wouldn't have been possible without Van's presence, who was becoming increasingly impressive as a lord. The vice commander rushed to tell the protagonist that they had succeeded, and the boy thanked him because they only managed it thanks to his orders. Van finally climbs to the top of the wall to check the bodies of those dinosaurs. He is shocked to see that not only were they enormous, but they also managed to take down 44 of them in just a few minutes. Dee is left wondering what the boy meant by dinosaurs, but in any case, the plans worked out. No one would have imagined that mere wooden arrows could cause such damage. If it weren't for Van's creation of the ballistae, perhaps the village wouldn't even exist anymore. Looking closer, some of the bandits who had fled up to that point had survived, but only about 30 of them. Soon, the soldiers prepare to tie them up, and Dee warns that if they don't want to be killed, they should do as ordered. The men promise they would change as long as they aren't handed over to the authorities. They would never endure a life as slaves after everything they had done. In light of this desperation, Rhonda comments on how those individuals occasionally raided the village. That's why all the villagers are furious with the bandits who try to plead for their lives, especially after several innocent lives had been stolen and many had perished from hunger. Van approaches the villager who almost hit one of the invaders, asking him not to dirty his hands that way. The boy agreed that the men should be punished for everything they had done, but he didn't want the villagers to have to stain their hands with blood. Thus, he announces to the bandits that they would all have to face the consequences of their actions and would be handed over to the authorities. Until that happens, he would make them contribute for the good of the village and work. The bandits were responsible for removing the useful parts of the dragons for sale, such as the eyes, fangs, and claws. Several things happened during that week, and Ortho felt that this mess would continue for a long time. After all, there were 44 monster bodies to dispose of, and even with Van's magical swords, they would only be able to get rid of 4 to 5 of them per day. They had to hurry because taking too long would cause the meat to spoil in the long run. Since that day, Dee, Ortho, and their respective groups worked to clean up the carcasses in front of the village. Van changed the working materials to cleaning knives, which were sharper and more practical to use. The teams managed to finish the job after 3 long days. And then, the following night, everyone was gathered for a celebratory party in honor of the village's fortification. Now they wouldn't have to worry about money or the cruel changes of seasons anymore. This time, everyone would have the chance to drink plenty, but no more than 2 cups per person. Finally, Van finished the speech, and the villagers toasted, enjoying the grand feast. Incredibly, the dragon meat was delicious, and the protagonist was surprised when he ate it for the first time. Ortho felt proud and explained how this was only possible because the creature's meat was protected by its hard scales. But even after they managed to eat enough to fill their stomachs, there would still be plenty left to sell later. It was clear that Van's work creating the ballistae was as powerful as the other weapons they had gained. Dee was startled to discover that the Lord had created special swords for the adventurers, feeling down for being overlooked. After all, Ortho, Puriel, and Kusara were able to enjoy the new swords easily to clean the carcasses. After seeing them show off so much, the vice commander practically whined for Van to create a special blade for him too. Since he had always been quite loyal to the Lord, he should be well rewarded, and having proper armaments would certainly allow him to acquire more resources than usual. The villagers also approached the protagonist to thank him for all the food. Some of them even wanted to serve him again and please him a bit more. Others were grateful because Van prevented them from getting their hands dirty while facing the bandits. For the sake of those who had passed away, they were all determined to make that village an even better place to live. Even Rhonda's family was happy with how pleasant that night was, where they could eat and laugh together. Enjoying this moment of achievement alongside aristocrats was new for commoners like them. Esparta interjected in the conversation, mentioning that it would be a problem if they only saw the village lord as a noble. Till added that Van's worth was in his character, and this only proved that he had the potential to do much more in the future. Meanwhile, Ortho told Van that the value of a dragon with scales would be around 20 gold coins. It was a considerable amount because most of the meat would be rotten and they couldn't sell it. Considering that about 30 bodies would remain, the money earned from selling them would be around 300 coins. When converted to yen, Van was sure it would be worth almost 300 million. Esparta praised the Lord for successfully defending against the mythical monsters, and the protagonist thanked him, responding that he also helped by placing a protective barrier. However, the butler commented that there was a certain problem they needed to resolve. There is a law stating that a village or city receiving more than 100 gold coins must pay a 50% fee to the marquisate. Van was surprised and asked if the nobility would eventually know about the state of the village, and Esparta replied that although it was difficult to keep the events there a secret, it was not impossible. This left Van once again quite impressed. After all, he didn't know anyone who had served Japal as well as that butler. Even so, this man was trying to propose a way to deceive his former master with great casualness. Hiding what happened in the village could be seen as an act of betrayal to the protagonist's family. For now, the boy decided to listen to what idea Esparta had in mind. The man explained that they should report what happened to Van's older brother, Mercia. In short, they would pass on to him the credit for the defeat of the dragons. If they could share the profits and achievements, then Mercia would also receive some recognition alongside Van. This way, the chances of the elder becoming the head of the family someday would increase, and the calm life Van wished to have could continue. The protagonist praised Esparta's idea, and they agreed to proceed with it. The next day, the villagers soon greeted the boy with a huge smile. The villagers were being quite benevolent and were in good spirits after the celebration of the previous day. There were even some men who asked for Till's hand in marriage. Instead of responding, Van took the maid's hand and pulled her along with him, which made her laugh because it had been a while since he had acted like that. After a while, he released her palm, and Till was surprised at how quickly he had become content with such a little affection. In fact, although he was only 8 years old, Van knew he needed to act like the lord he was, and for that, he could not throw away his own dignity. On the other hand, he couldn't help but think that there would come a day when Till would stop supporting him as she got older. In the meantime, her happiness would be one of his top priorities. The protagonist begins to mention that in the future, Till might be interested in someone, and the maid interrupts him to say that she only cared about him. That was why there was no need to worry too much right now. A little later, they go to the walls, and someone shouts from the watchtower to alert Van about the arrival of the merchants Bell and Lango. They could merely distinguish the dark silhouettes in the distance, but somehow that guy was able to see the travelers' faces. Van asks if they should first raise the drawbridge and prepare the ballista, which was immediately refused because they were not bandits. But the Lord explains that although they are in a cart, it doesn't mean that only merchants would be there, as bandits could also hide and disguise themselves. It was necessary to be skeptical to ensure everyone's safety, and thus, the boy orders Ortho and Dee to be called. There was still much to be done from then on, so everything would depend on how Van would effectively use each opportunity. Meanwhile, the travelers arriving in the cart approached slowly, with the horse driver complaining that they had gotten stuck. One of the wagons broke down in the middle of the road, and that was the reason several products had become unusable. They would have to consider the cost and lodging this time, which was a problem since the trip had not even allowed them to earn enough money from sales. In the end, their journey only brought more bills despite them returning to Hashimura after so long away. However, as soon as they see the entrance to the village, they wonder if this was the same place they were used to seeing. The merchants are confused and even question whether they had accidentally taken the wrong path. Then a voice comes from above the walls to speak with the group. Van introduces himself as the owner of the village and demands to know the name of the sales company they belong to if they were indeed sellers. The men are shocked to have heard the surname Fertio, realizing it was the famous youngest son of the Marquis. What impresses them even more is how young the boy is, being practically a child, and yet having become the owner of the village. Finally, the cart driver introduces himself as Mary Bell, and beside him was his brother, named Lango. They were accompanied by a security guard who was a hired adventurer. Van asks Ortho if he knew that man, and he agrees he had seen that guard at the guild a few times as they used to drink together. In the end, the protagonist allowed them to enter the village, and the drawbridge lowered for their arrival. The merchants entered the fortress and were impressed by how much the place had changed since they traveled. Rhonda soon welcomed them, happy to see them back safely. The Lord also approached to greet them again, now more closely. The brothers bowed politely, and at that moment Van asked if they could sell pieces of a dragon's hooves. The duo immediately agreed, impressed that the new group protecting the village had been able to demonstrate such power to this extent. They practically cried with emotion, and the protagonist seized the opportunity to take them to the warehouse where they kept the products. As soon as they arrived at the location, the merchants froze in surprise at the huge pile of goods available there. Van explained that they had taken down more than 40 monsters and captured some bandits, so they wanted to take help to bring all of this to the big city. Moreover, they would be able to restore the destroyed wagon without any problems. Bell could hardly believe what he was hearing, and replied that they would need to call for helpers to do the loading as quickly as possible. They could probably finish within a month, and the Lord was fine with that, suggesting that the merchants rest a bit after the long journey and eat the fresh meat. At that moment, the seller realizes that they couldn't take so long to deliver the goods considering they could spoil in the long run. In this, Bell suggests taking the meat to a neighboring town to sell it, as they would surely be able to make good sales there. The protagonist is curious to know if they would be interested in buying so much food, and Lango explains that the place in question was actually another rather poor village, but this year, after paying the taxes, they would probably be left without resources. The merchants kind of wished they could help them, understanding the difficulties the poor town was facing, perhaps even offering meat for free. At first, Lango was worried about having the proposal rejected, but the protagonist agreed with the idea. Although it's good to seek benefits most of the time, they couldn't ignore people in need. In light of this display of great kindness, the merchant goes on to say that they would also pay a good amount for having managed to capture those bandits. Van thanks the seller for trying to find a way to compensate them, but prefers that the brothers come back to visit them in the future. And this time, they would negotiate high-quality armor. In addition to getting good carpenters and designers, it would be appropriate to hire professional blacksmiths. Later, when Van presented his creations, the merchants were amazed. Although the protagonist still hadn't been able to verify the advantages and disadvantages of them in combat, he believes they are good displays. Moreover, they also had the dragon skin pieces they obtained from the carcasses. As soon as they test their quality, they are impressed with how soft they were and how easily they could cut them. Not only because they obtained the dragon materials before they spoiled, but because they used the knives created by Van's magic. Even the security guard became interested in getting a new spear to work with. The business possibilities were endless, and the merchants were excited to sell the products. However, Bell suspects they might be unable to carry so many weapons at once, so they end up deciding to take them later. More time passes until nightfall, where the selling brothers took the opportunity to eat and rest a bit. The two were fascinated by the improvement of the place and suggested to Van about bringing a group of merchants to increase visitors throughout the month. The protagonist agreed because they needed some supplies, especially when a full meal was more than enough to make the villagers happy. Additionally, he would like to prepare an announcement regarding the weapons they were making there. At that moment, the brothers became nervous about the subject, and the boy assumes they want to make the business with Van's creations an exclusive sale between them. That said, Van comments that if the same two people try to sell through the usual routes, they would eventually discover the origin of the weaponry creation in the village. The two merchants sigh, ultimately agreeing to promote the protagonist's creation, because after all, the more they sell, the more they would earn. The Lord's proposal was for them to open a store in the village. Thus, they would be able to negotiate with owners of other businesses or sellers. Anyone who shows interest in local productions would be good. In the quest to make the environment stable, seizing every possible opportunity to boost the economy was important. So Van decides that he would build a house for Bell and Lango, thinking that building a store would save him the time of always having to negotiate with various different merchants. It would be beneficial for both parties, so the brothers agree to discuss this with their boss when they return to the big city. Lango would leave while Bell would stay to take care of the business there in the village. What would help a lot to convince the merchant chamber was the sword created by Van, which was made with dragon skin. Additionally, the boy sent a letter to Mersha detailing all of the protagonist's recent achievements that would be passed on to him. Furthermore, near the entrance of the village, the Lord built a store for Bell. The seller froze in shock at how fast the construction was, while Van mentions that the second floor was available for living and the basement was a warehouse. Although he tried to do his best to follow the merchant's instructions, it might not have turned out perfect, but Bell was so amazed that he barely heard him speak. The products should be ready within 2 weeks, and then they could put them on display. In the second half of the day, a group was selected to leave the village and head towards the nearest river. At first, Till is worried that the protagonist might get tired after walking so much, but he was fine. It doesn't take long for Kamshin to take advantage of being in front and clear the way using his own sword. It was so chivalrous that it made Van feel somewhat moved. The truth was that he would like to show his gratitude and kindness to everyone, but he was unable to maintain his own strength all the time and ended up needing to rely on Kamshin during those moments. The entire journey they had made to the destination took about an hour. Before them, a large and beautiful river appeared, from which they could draw drinking water. Thus, the construction of supplies began. Esparta, with the help of his magic, dug several meters in just an instant. While the butler took a break, D, Kamshin, and the others occupied his original task. The protagonist followed them from behind and reinforced the protective walls. In the end, the large amount of magical power from Esparta became a surprise. This whole situation made the vice commander start laughing loudly out of nowhere. The others who helped him were impressed that even at 40 years old, he was still capable of using so much strength as if he were in his youth. Till recognized that this was a very hard job to do, considering the enormous distance between the river and the village. On the other hand, this was a necessary task because they would be unable to live without water. Van believed that by being together, they would be able to achieve the goal they had. If the conditions for improving their living situation were met, it would also facilitate the arrival of visitors later. It took almost 8 hours for the group to start seeing the village in the distance. This ended up shocking even the protagonist because that task was originally supposed to take a long week. At that point, Van said they should stop for today, which confused Esparta and D as both still felt they could continue. But the others were so tired that they could barely get up. The vice commander grumbled a bit because he was actually having fun with this new training. His unstoppable vigor made Van consider that this guy was simply a muscle-bound idiot. Even Esparta had a very serious expression, which was almost frightening. On the other hand, this day only demonstrated the difference in strength between the two generations and was good for the younger ones to show more respect to them. The next day, to the group's surprise, they were able to finish the excavation by the end of the morning. And then, all that was left was to let the water flow through the path they had created. All of this happened thanks to everyone's collaboration, and Van thanked them for it. Finally, Esparta was given permission to release the barrier, and as a result, the flowing water rushed through the huge hole. The scene was wonderful, and the entire team applauded, celebrating that they had managed to fulfill the original goal. The villagers were equally amazed to see that drinking water was closer than ever. Rhonda commented that in the past, they always had to think a lot when using it, and sometimes had to make long trips to obtain it. Then, Van explained that its use should be done carefully, and in this case they should always boil it before using it in meals. Suddenly, a knight named Lu approached and handed a mineral to the Lord. He was interested in knowing what kind of creation would be produced with the boy's magic. Apparently, since Van was making those weapon projects for sale, the knight had become really excited about them. The two decided to work on the new production together. The filtration machine made of branches, leaves, sand, soil, stones, and cloth would be at the end of the channel in the village. The water coming from there would be stored directly inside the metal gear. The required amount of water would be drained into the tank and would proceed to the boiler, automatically carrying out the weakening process. To ignite it, they would use a fire magic crystal to automate this process as well. The group tested the new channel that now passed under the bridge and were amazed by the beauty of the village's entrance. Van asked Esparta if there would be a flood if the water level rose during the rains. The butler replied that depending on the volume, the channel could widen and expand the construction, which could cause problems later as well. In that case, the Lord knew he needed to ensure that the water returned to the river in case it overloaded the available space, or perhaps they could create a lake at the back of the village. Esparta believed that the second idea was better because having a reserve during dry times would be of great help. A lake should be built 200 meters away from the village as a resource in emergency situations. 3 days later, it was ready and made the view of the surroundings even more beautiful than before. Van was really happy to have a large supply of water available. However, during one night, the boy was awakened by a commotion that even Rhonda was in a panic over. Dee and Esparta were heading towards the scene in question. Till recounts that they were all heading to Lake Van, and the protagonist questions who gave it such a ridiculous name. Then, the maid explains that it was a tribute to the merit of the Lord himself and would be preserved as a legacy for future generations. Moreover, they were even considering naming the village Van as well, which only makes the boy even more anxious about how embarrassing it was. In any case, he hurries towards the villagers who had gathered near the lake. As he approaches, some people point out the presence of something strange in the water. When seen up close, it becomes clear that it was some kind of creature. They said that at the bottom of the river within the forest lived a mythical animal with perfect blue hair. It was half human and half mermaid, also known as Abgalu. It wasn't the kind of being that was easily seen, but now they were all seeing it right before their eyes. Van wonders if that creature was a child because it was small and tries to communicate, but only receives silence in response. It didn't seem like the Abgalu understood human words, so the protagonist asks Till and Kamsin to bring some meats and fruits. What they needed to start a good relationship was a peace offering through food. At that moment, the creature slowly approaches, and everyone tenses up, preparing. for a future battle if it happens. However, the Abgalu catches the scent of the food and asks if it could eat. At that instant, the protagonist is pleased to see that she was indeed capable of communicating. This causes her to quickly retreat back into the water, and Van apologizes for scaring her. The Lord explains that this was dragon meat taken from within its scales, and if she wanted, they could dry it for consumption as well. Abgalu asks who caught it, and everyone replies that it was Van. Although the boy responds that it was thanks to the ballistae, the villagers agree that it was still his creation, and who used his creations was just an additional detail. Suddenly, the Abgalu disappears into the water, leaving the entire group confused about what just happened. The next day, Van was awakened before sunrise again by shouting. Till apologizes for scaring him, but they received a message that the villagers were under attack, and everyone panicked again. Apparently, the enemy had already taken over the waterway, which leaves the protagonist confused but alert. In the meantime, the fortress had been filled with soldiers prepared with weapons and ballistae for combat. In the water, several Abgalu had appeared, and were looking in the direction of the humans. The day before, they had only found a child, but suddenly there were men and women of various ages gathered there. But the one who really caught attention was one wearing a crown and was the first to communicate, wishing to talk. That was certainly the leader of the group, and Van was even startled by his gaze but tried to remain serious. Therefore, the boy asks Dee to accompany him when he goes down to communicate with the Abgalu. On the other hand, Lango was excited because that water people brought several rare items, and there would be customers from all over the nation interested in them. He would love to take a closer look, so the protagonist allowed more people to accompany him to meet the leader of the invaders. The Abgalu leader tells that his daughter was very grateful for what Van did for her. Moreover, he had heard about the boy who was able to defeat a dragon. The others from the water people were impressed that the words of that Abgalu child were indeed true. The leader admits that the boy was indeed a brave human. Then, he came to visit the village to affirm that he agreed with the marriage between Van and Lotta Priora. The protagonist is left confused and shouts what that means. To begin with, he didn't even know who that other person was and how they came to the conclusion of a commitment between two children. His reaction bothers the Abgalu because his daughter was the only one he had, being someone who would certainly have a bright future. Van asks where the girl in question was and realizes she was playing alongside other children of her own kind. The age difference was too great, and the Lord asks the Abgalu leader since when they had been thinking about marriage. Vesta explains that they were of the Lotta race, so they were not used to speaking with humans. However, recently the river where they lived was taken over by scaled dragons, and because of that, several of their companions died. Since then, they had been looking for a strong husband for Priora, someone who could keep them safe. Vaughn understands the situation better, aware that aristocrats also tend to offer their children's hands for political reasons. So he replies to the leader that a girl like Priora should only get involved with those she loves. In this case, he was willing to offer protection to the Lotta, even if they didn't need to get involved in marriages. Vesta agreed and said they would live with her son-in-law from now on. The protagonist asks them to move to the lake instead of staying by the river due to the nearby bridges and the possibility of scaring the merchants who would visit them later. Late to realize, he notices he has just been called a son-in-law and barely has time to explain that he declined the marriage proposal since all the Lotta had left. Even Priora waves to Van in the distance, calling him husband. On the other hand, Belle remains excited because they would acquire more rare materials for the shop. Esparta mentions that they were lucky to befriend an Abdalu. However, no one there could have predicted such a situation. Even Till was reflecting that he would accept the situation as long as it was Van's choice. In any case, the Lotta race moved to live by the lake since then. This made Van wonder if he would have to take care of them too, somewhat devastated by the increasing number of burdens. Following this thought, the protagonist built 2 houses by the lake to let the Abgalu relax. Thanks to the roof and walls, they were able to live safely. Seeing that the space became quite popular, the protagonist felt relieved. Even Esparta was impressed that Van had knowledge of modern constructions he had never even heard of, and the Lord tried not to elaborate too much in his explanations, opting to change the subject. Since then, the villagers began to contact the Abgalu more frequently, sharing grains and food. Suddenly, people started talking about the fact that this mysterious race could bring rare ores. Eventually, they managed to create a good relationship that turned into a kind of friendship. Because of this, Van decided they would build another wall even more powerful that would surround the lake and keep the Abgalu protected. Esparta ended up suggesting they prepare to expand the village into a city that could accommodate 10,000 people. Although it seems like a lot, it would be necessary to maintain the safety of the people living by the lake with guards and prevent ill-intentioned humans from causing trouble. Even if Van tried to propose something smaller, the butler remained firm in his words. It would be better to spend time developing more space for everyone to live and avoid a conflict later over territory. The protagonist ends up feeling pressured because, as always, once Esparta makes a decision, he never goes back. Moreover, the butler suggests that the ideal size would be at least 600 square meters, adding houses, guilds, and various other constructions. They should start with a fortress that would surround all this space and then add the other construction projects. Van feels exhausted just thinking about how much work all this would entail. However, he mentions he was thinking of creating a city in a variant shape. The idea was a space that resembled a star, where they would have watchtowers at each point to protect and alert in case of danger. Just as they use now, they would place not only ballistae but also cannons and other types of weapons prepared to defend the wall. This would prevent them from having to run back and forth to defend themselves in case of an invasion, and everyone would be able to focus on the counterattack. This was one of the reasons why Van also needed to hire more people. Esparta agreed with the proposal because even good mages would be unable to hold a front line as prepared as this. While they were discussing, suddenly a knight burst into the room. Immediately, the protagonist asks what happened, and the man replies that a message has arrived from Count Ferdinand. Lou adds that there was not only the emblem of this noble family, but also that of Viscount Cayenne. Originally, Ferdinand was the owner of that city, and perhaps now he wants it back. There were 3 carriages and 100 soldiers waiting outside the walls. Meanwhile, outside, 2 women were interested in entering the gates to check if the so-called Prodigy child really existed as the rumors said. At the same time, Van was dressing for the formal meeting, not believing they had received visitors so suddenly. Till had already prepared tea and snacks to welcome them. A little later, those 2 women entered the meeting room, surprising the protagonist. As always, he could never quite assess the appearance he had of the people in this world. One of them was a child, but the boy did not intend to underestimate either of them at this point. Van introduced himself formally, and the taller woman said her name was Panamera Carrera Cayenne, recently promoted to Viscountess. Next to her was Ferdinand's daughter, named Arut Anne Ferdinand. As far as it seems, the Count asked for the girl to meet the new lord of the village. It didn't take long for the protagonist to understand that by sending Arut to see him, it meant that Panamera was merely the escort. Although that woman is intimidating, the boy responds that he is grateful to receive them and asks them to sit down. It was clear that Panamera was not an ordinary person to have moved from the position of knight to baroness and then becoming a viscountess in such a short time. She was the kind of person who had as much strength as intelligence. Panamera observes that Van is indeed young, but he seems quite calm for his age and questions whether he knows the reason for the visit. The protagonist realizes he is being tested at this point. A count who had his territory reduced even under the king's mandate would be furious. Then, the genius Van was sent to the remote area and began to make it prosper, so it is possible that Ferdinand fears an attack over land disputes. Perhaps his idea was to send his own daughter alongside the new Viscountess under the pretext of gathering information on an opponent and maybe making a peace offer. Upon saying all this to Panamera, she starts to laugh loudly and agrees that his presumption was correct. Now that the Ferdio family was looking for a suitable heir and had Van drawing attention over the last 2 years, obviously the other nobles would be interested. If a mere child was able to accomplish all this even without what are considered suitable magical powers, some suspected that the definition of good magical skills could change. Even though Van cannot use any of the 4 elements, Panamera does not understand why that boy was chosen as the owner of this land. According to rumors, he was a prodigy, and normally a landlord should be someone well educated to govern a group of people. That is why they had been trying to understand Van's situation, who seemed to have an inappropriate ambition for his own position and age. The protagonist understands what the woman is trying to say and agrees that he is not an individual with suitable powers compared to the others in the nobility. But the other fears generated by the rumors were unfounded. After all, they only sent Van there on a whim. Panamera remained silent for a moment before saying that this was stupid. She heard that the village had more than 100 houses, but in just 2 months the boy managed to build a fortress around the buildings. In addition to all the high-quality materials they possessed, Van was accompanied by an experienced butler and a master swordsman. Given everything they knew so far, Panamera comes to the conclusion that the boy must have around 5,000 subordinates. A technology that allows him to move so many soldiers without being noticed was a problem, and they began to presume that the village was gradually becoming a military base. Van holds back his laughter, thinking that from the perspective of outsiders, all of this made sense, but little did they know that the boy was expelled from his own home. Panamera questions the reason for the laughter with clear hostility, which makes Kamshin and Dee prepare for a possible battle. But the lord of the village just starts to laugh and apologizes for having created such a tense atmosphere all of a sudden. He decides to explain that this was all an illusion. After all, the only things the protagonist could bring with him were Kamshin and some luggage. The Ferdio family didn't even celebrate his departure with pride. Instead, they asked for it to be done quietly and without drawing attention. Panamera questions about the high-class subordinates he had with him. Before Van could respond, D himself interrupts, saying it was because they were impressed with the talent they witnessed from him and decided to follow him. The vice commander was so brazen that even after receiving a letter from the Order of Knights ordering him to return, he completely ignored the demand. On the other hand, Esparta says he was already quite old. When he heard about Van moving to a village, he thought it would be a good excuse to retire and pass on his skills to Japal's son. Till takes the opportunity to say that even if that boy is an aristocrat, he is someone who appreciates the community and has become someone everyone there admires. The protagonist was very grateful to have so many incredible individuals by his side. In this case, Panamera decides to ask about the sudden transformation that happened in the village, and the boy stands up, deciding that he would personally show the visitors how they had done all of that. Outside the house, Van is startled to realize that the Viscountess was indeed accompanied by dozens of knights. Panamera announces that they would go out to explore and the men must remain on standby. Meanwhile, the protagonist asks his own subordinates to bring some wooden blocks. Thus, the entire group walks out of the city for a while until the knight begins to get irritated for not knowing where they were going. Esparta tells the lord that they were in the right area and could start preparing about 2 meters ahead before adjusting if necessary. The boy explains to Panamera that he intended to create a wall for the fortress before her eyes. As soon as the butler uses his magic, Panamera realizes that he was quite a skilled mage. This means that as soon as the magical power loses its strength, that pillar built by Esparta would break and dissolve. Using all the materials they had acquired some time ago, the boy begins to create a more substantial version of the wall. He wishes to make a concrete and perfect version, but since they had enough stock for now, he only prepares a test version. Panamera discovers that those materials were the same used to build the houses, all made of wood as a base. Next, Van decides to create the gate using metal and imagining the appropriate shape. After finishing the use of his magic, he turns to the two women with a smile, saying that this was the method they used to change the structure of the village. Arut was the first to ask what type of magic that boy used, and Panamera was equally curious. Then, the protagonist explains that he is only capable of using item creation and nothing more. In society, this was considered a useless type of magic. At that moment, the count's daughter remembers something about her own life. Since her father was always busy, he never had time to offer her. Arut's mother had no interest in her own daughter, and thus left her with a nanny. The reason for this was quite obvious, as she was a completely useless girl. Having a shy nature and being quite slow to learn, there was no talent in which Arut excelled. The only thing she was good enough at and enjoyed doing was using puppet magic. Although she was inadequate in everything that required physical effort, Arut was able to control and move dolls as if they were her own body. This hobby made her happier than anything, and the discovery of this talent made her believe she would receive approval from her parents. However, the girl's mother rejected her with a slap to the face. Arut did not understand what she had done wrong to harden her to that point, but later came to understand that that type of magic was considered useless in the upper class. In the end, her last hope of being recognized was discarded. After that day, Arut's mother stopped visiting her, and others showed no interest in her existence. Isolated in her own room, the girl shed tears and lamented her own existence. When she turned 10, her father called her to his office. There, Panamera was unsure if she was the right person to accompany the count's daughter, and Ferdinand assured her that everything would be fine as long as she followed the instructions given. At that point, the knight approached Arut and greeted her, asking if she was aware of her arranged marriage. From the girl's shocked expression, it was clear she had never heard anything about it. Then, Panamera explains that if she were a skilled individual, they should consider marriage. Arut, confused, questions whether being a useless daughter would lead to her being expelled from home. And the knight immediately denies that this was the case, as everything would be fine as long as they could find a good person to take care of that girl. As soon as Panamera comforted her and stroked her head, Arut felt that she was the first and only person in the world who showed she cared about her. The journey they both took lasted 3 long weeks, but the girl was happy to have left home for the first time in her life. Moreover, the Viscountess was quite nice, even when she often got angry. After Arut shared how useless she felt, Panamera hugged her and spoke about the situation with great kindness. Even when the girl suddenly cried, the knight never got irritated or hit her, but stroked her hair. Arut became quite attached to the touch of Panamera's hands as they were affectionate and warm, like magical hands that drove away all pain and loneliness from her heart. Panamera used to joke that her palms were full of calluses from training with the sword, but the girl didn't mind that. It wouldn't be long before their journey came to an end, and Ferdinand's daughter did not want to get married. That was why she didn't want to meet or get close to Van, maintaining an uninterested expression the whole time. It was clear that the lord of those lands was quite special, being the exact opposite of what the girl expected. Being much younger than Arut and surrounded by loyal and skilled servants, he certainly must have been quite loved by his own family and full of incredible powers. This thought of hers was shattered as soon as Van told her about being kicked out of his own house. The girl witnessed the miracle made with the creation magic that had always been considered useless, and the feelings of envy within her began to shift to interest. Aristocrats had always been interested only in the four elements, and that was the reason Arut had abandoned his own ability to use puppets. However, meeting Van made her think that if she hadn't stopped practicing, who knows, she might have become as incredible as that boy. Panamera mentions that the protagonist's powers seem dangerous, as he must be capable of even building a military base in an instant if he wished. The problem was that Japal didn't know his own son's capabilities, and didn't even try to get to know those skills better. This decision was quite foolish, and the Viscountess believes that Van is a figure with great potential to help in the expansion of lands. Upon noticing that Panamera changed the way she referred to him, the boy invites the visitors to spend the night there, as he intended to continue building the fortress the next day. Returning to the village, Van explains that he built each of the houses there, and this generated great interest from the Viscountess, who asked how the production magic worked and what types of materials were used. After what seemed like an eternity of conversation, those two managed to understand each other. In the meantime, Panamera mentioned that she also needed to discuss an arranged marriage with Arut, and the protagonist quickly responds that they could find peace between the families without resorting to marriage for convenience. However, seeing how much that prodigy from the Ferdio family was able to progress on his own only drew more attention from Panamera. She recounts that when she heard from Count Ferdinand about marrying off his own daughter, she was against the idea. It didn't take much intelligence to realize that Arut wouldn't be happy with a life like that. Van agrees, as depending on the circumstances of the marriage, she could end up freezing or starving. Who knows, she might even die at the hands of bandits. For this reason, before they reached the village, the Viscountess considered several ways to help the girl. The protagonist reflects that the reason Arut seemed so apathetic since he first saw her was that she was already expecting to be abandoned again. He kind of understood the girl's feelings as he was in a similar situation. However, now Panamera had changed her own thoughts and would accept the marriage proposal if it were Van who got involved with the Count's daughter. After all, that prodigy had a lot of intelligence considering his age, and his companions showed great confidence in him. If they were the same age, the Viscountess would even make Van her husband. This made the protagonist quite happy to be so admired, and he even wanted to hear more compliments. However, the negotiations were still about Arut, and they needed to reach a conclusion regarding her engagement. Although the Viscountess did not intend to force the girl to agree, she warned that it would be difficult to find a better partner than this. Nervous, Arut thinks that even if the protagonist was a good person, she still wasn't sure. Van also tries to evade marriage and mentions again that if there was a reason for Ferdinand's daughter not to refuse, then she could live in the village with them. Being such an important decision that would determine the course of her life, the girl needed to buy time to reflect on it. Panamera asks if Van wouldn't gain advantages from the marriage as well. After all, his power was something rare that could be targeted by other countries, and it was necessary to continue protecting himself as time went on. By getting involved with Arut, he would have support from her family, and also from the Viscountess herself. Although the protagonist considered her words to be truths, it still didn't make sense for the Count to send his own daughter to him. Van's powers and achievements were hidden, and Ferdinand wouldn't have any benefit considering the circumstances under which he sent Arut. For now, Panamera decides that she would give the Lord the whole day to consider the marriage, and if he was interested in knowing more about it, they could talk. Although the two intended to spend the night there, they wouldn't forget that they were in enemy territory, and the Viscountess would keep some subordinates nearby for safety. Arut feels embarrassed to realize that she would have to sleep at Van's house, even though the protagonist himself feels it is too early to consider such things. The boy doesn't even bother to think too much about it, and decides to build a hotel for the two to stay right now. For the soldiers, he prepared a room for 4 people so they could camp and be comfortable. She also invited everyone to dinner, under the pretext of serving wolf meat that they had recently hunted. After the dragons were defeated, the animals that lived in the forest returned to their natural habitat, and thus the city acquired another stock of fresh meat. Till was excited to prepare such a tasty meal that would be perfect for Van's wedding with Arut. As someone who had spent her whole life alongside the boy, knowing he would get involved with someone else made her somewhat sad. But the maid believes he had to find a wife who would support him. Moreover, if his future wife is good enough, she would certainly allow Till to be by their side as well. Kamshin agrees, and, if given the chance, would suggest that Van get involved with someone stronger like Panamera. Esparta takes the opportunity to mention that Graf Ferdinand, as they imagined, would gain nothing from his own daughter's marriage. It was hard to say that Arut was kicked out of the house for being useless, just like Van. The Scuderia kingdom had been expanding its territory for 5 years, and the neighbors were starting to get scared of being future targets. Therefore, the king would not create conflicts among allies, and there were several methods to gain control over them, such as sabotage, taking their rights, and even expanding the lands further. In any case, Van believed that the most important part now was to wait for Arut's decision. If she didn't want to go home, then she could live there without worry, but if she wanted to return, they wouldn't force her to stay in the city. They hadn't had the chance to talk yet, so the protagonist decided to do that during dinner. When everyone gathered in the dining room, the first topic Van suggested was about getting new ingredients and making something sweet in the future. Arut was caught off guard by them trying to talk to her and attempted to respond that she liked meat and salad with fruits as well. Deep down, the girl had serious difficulties raising her voice as she had spent many years without interacting with others, but at least it didn't seem like Van was bothered by her shyness. The girl couldn't even believe she had the chance to meet such a considerate person. Then, the protagonist asked what kinds of hobbies she had, and Arut mentioned liking cute things like dolls and flowers. Van realized he had never seen any dolls before, and asked her to show him some she had on a future occasion. The calm atmosphere made the Count's daughter almost feel like she was talking to an adult, but the Lord was even younger than her. Arut commented that her dolls were in the carriage, and she could show them the next day. In response, the protagonist smiled and thanked her. This made the girl feel a kind of happiness growing inside her heart, like a strange sensation she wasn't used to feeling. Beside her, Panamera smiled, clearly noticing what was happening in her heart. After that, Van continued to engage Arut in conversation for a while during dinner. Somehow, she was gradually getting used to talking, and even wanted to respond to what was asked. This made her wish she could start a conversation on her own and look directly into Van's eyes. However, dinner ended, and the girl was unable to do that. The group left the dining room, and the Viscountess mentioned how safe and peaceful the village was. The meals were so delicious that it made her wonder how they managed to get so many high-quality ingredients. Besides, all the citizens knew and respected the Lord of the Lands. Van ended up agreeing with this observation, and Panamera was surprised that he hadn't used the topic to boast about his own achievements. The boy explained that the materials were provided by the citizens themselves, and he was only responsible for adapting them to certain uses. In the future, when the village grows to accommodate 1,000 people, who knows, Van might find a good reason to genuinely boast. These words left the Viscountess laughing, and then she waved goodbye to go to the hotel. At that moment, the protagonist realized that Arut had fallen behind because she probably wanted to say something. But 5 long minutes passed, and the girl said nothing. Suddenly, she practically shouted a thank you and explained how tense she had felt because she thought he was the person she would be forced to marry. But after seeing how kind the Lord was, she stopped worrying about unnecessary thoughts. After saying all this, Arut ran off saying goodnight and followed Panamera. Van felt somewhat confused but sensed that somehow he had at least made a good first impression. While running inside the hotel, the Count's daughter realized she had spoken too quickly and had been too cowardly to hear a response. It was probably quite rude of her, and she wonders if Van would find her strange for it. In the middle of the run, the girl realizes she got lost in the hallways and ends up being guided by an employee to her own room. As soon as she finds the Viscountess, she notices that she was getting ready for bed. Arut is amazed at how attractive the woman was, both physically and in her personality. On the other hand, Panamera jokingly comments that children tend to form bonds because they feel a pleasant chemistry during conversation. Faced with the girl's embarrassment, the knight mentions that although the original plan would have them return the next day, they could still spend a little more time in the village. It was necessary for Arut to understand that they couldn't take too long to make a decision and suggest that they at least pay the hotel for their stay. With Panamera's encouragement, the girl thinks she would try to talk properly with Van the next day. She believes that being the Lord of the Lands, he would likely listen to her without judging her hesitation or shyness. For the first time in a long time, Arut was looking forward to the arrival of the next day. The next morning, Van announces to the villagers that the construction of the fortress wall would be under Esparta's direction. This wouldn't be the first time, so they certainly wouldn't have problems with the project's progress, even if it was a large construction. After warning everyone to be careful to avoid getting hurt near the service area, the protagonist asks what Ortho and the others would do. Van noticed since the last time they had a meeting that the villagers began to align themselves like soldiers. In this, the leader of the adventurers says they would be going out to hunt mythical animals again now that they had new swords. The Lord merely warns that they couldn't damage the targets too much or they wouldn't be able to use the materials they obtained, even if they sold them to Bel. In any case, the day's tasks were well distributed. Since it was Friday, Van mentions that that night and the next day, using the meat they had, they could celebrate with a barbecue. That was enough to motivate all the villagers to put in effort at work. Several individuals who had previously been quiet or skeptical began to show more energy, which was good. Panamera appears a little later to greet the protagonist and talk about the speech she just heard. It was impressive that the boy managed to boost everyone's morale, even though it wasn't for a military group. In this, Van says that the top 10 performers in their respective areas would also be rewarded with the best alcohol. During the conversation, Arut appears and is the first to timidly greet the Lord. She talks about how the weather was pleasant and that it should be a good day. Van is happy to see that the Count's daughter was excited that morning and asks if she managed to rest well the night before. While responding, the girl happily realizes that she actually started a dialogue. Not wanting to scare him, Arut tries to speak slowly to express herself, wishing to see the world through Van's eyes and get to know him better. With that in mind, she asks if she could watch him work. A little later, the two visitors accompanied the protagonist when he went to take care of the village's sewage. The pipes ran beneath each building and needed to be regularly cleaned to prevent water flow from being obstructed. After flowing through the ground, it would eventually return to the river, and maintaining them was important for the health safety of the residents. Suddenly, some Abgalu appear asking if they needed help with the task. Panamera tenses upon seeing them while Arit is amazed as she has never seen a race like that. The aquatic group explains that they lived there and received help from Van, including Priora saying she was his wife. With a sigh, the protagonist tries to explain that it wasn't at all what they were thinking. He had already tried to explain to Vesta that they weren't really engaged. These words leave Priora sulking as she walks away, with the other children complaining to the protagonist for being so cruel. At the same time, they loved the fruits that Van usually gifted and wanted to eat some. The Lord replies that he would do that later, but would love the help of the adult Abgalu to clean the sewage. With the help of the water people, they managed to contain the violent water flow and finish the task quickly. This was a job they usually did several times during the day to maintain local cleanliness. Panamera asks if Van was able to control the Abgalu, and the boy explains that for certain reasons, that race began to reside there and were used to helping each other. A little later, the trio goes to where Esparta was organizing the wall project. As expected from the butler, his performance leading the workers was impeccable, and they were progressing quickly. The surface was doing well for now, but some angles of the wall were proving difficult to make. The protagonist suggests they start by drawing a hexagonal shape on the ground and work from that as a base. Esparta immediately agreed with instructions that were usually out of the ordinary, which only demonstrates how loyal and reliable he was. Creating projects like this was laborious, and even Van, who had learned trigonometry in his previous life, struggled to put it into practice. In this, Panamera approaches, suggesting they could help with the task of making the drawing on the ground. They could use the soldiers they brought to stretch a rope and connect the diagram to ensure they had the correct size and shape. As soon as Van notices that Arut has fallen behind, he asks if she is okay being without a bodyguard like that. Since the girl didn't seem truly bothered, it was probably a way to show confidence to the protagonist. In the meantime, the protagonist decides to fortify the wall while the Viscountess helps Esparta with the measurements. When the two children climb the wall, the Count's daughter asks what exactly that huge weapon installed in the stones was, and Van explains that it is a ballista capable of firing large arrows to protect the village from invaders. As the walls surrounding the village were widened, the ballistas were recreated to be almost 3 times larger. Each of the arrows had become more robust, and the device became more practical, capable of firing twice per second. The protagonist would love to make a crossbow, but he didn't want to make mistakes and end up being a little boy unable to protect himself in front of 2 women. There was a part of him that wanted to continue being admired, even though he was quite young. For now, Van asks Kamshin to test the new weapons they created. The shot from the ballista was so powerful that it caused an explosion at the target. Arut was startled by the firepower, and Panamera came running to check what that loud noise was. Van calms her down, explaining that it was just a test of the new ballista they installed, and there was nothing to worry about. In this, the Viscountess becomes quite interested in those weapons and bombards the Lord with questions that leave him a bit pressured by her incessant curiosity. Instead of telling what he knew, the boy simply says it is military secret and he cannot talk. Panamera understands that this makes sense and decides not to ask anymore, but offers to buy a ballista for any amount. Again, Van refuses to do what the knight wanted, as he could only consider the idea of passing their firearms to another noble if they were allies. She can hardly believe the enormous amount of technology she has witnessed with her own eyes so far. That remote and poor village had developed and achieved unimaginable things even for people of royalty, and had gained the respect of different races to coexist in peace. Not only that, but the shy Arut was gradually starting to come out of her own cocoon to talk and express herself better. This was a change of events that Panamera hadn't felt in her own life for a long time. In light of this, the woman decides to promise Van that she would make a formal alliance with him. Normally, such support within the same country was made to seek protection, but Panamera would ensure they received benefits equally this time. In this way, she would become the protagonist's most powerful ally in the kingdom and was willing to throw away her own dignity as a noble if she betrayed him. This was quite a rare opportunity for Van, who had few connections with others of the upper class. Therefore, the Lord accepted the proposal and smiled, thanking her. Upon witnessing this alliance, all the soldiers under the Vice-Countess's command bow, and Till next to Kamshin imitates them. Not fully understanding what was happening, Arut does the same, although she doesn't need to do that. This would be the first official cooperation they would have, so Panamera states that it was a memorable day. If Van gives her one of the ballistas, she was willing to lend 100 soldiers for 2 weeks. But if one of them does not return after the deadline, the woman would make sure to make the boy pay for it. Considering the person they served, those subordinates should be strong and loyal, so the protagonist understands well how valuable they were. Van agrees with the suggestion and offers transportation to carry the ballista since it was quite heavy. When Panamera mentions they could make the arrows themselves, Kamshin asks for permission to speak and explains that it would be a good idea to take the ones made by Van. The girl shows the sword she received as a gift, and the protagonist remembers how happy she was at the time. Apparently Kamshin admired the Viscountess, and this was a side of her that was quite new. In the midst of the dialogue, Panamera says she felt bad facing opponents while equipped with armor and shields. These items were disposable and only relied on their own weapons for combat. Upon taking a battle stance, Kamshin decides to accept the challenge and brandishes her sword against that of the Viscountess. At first, Panamera notices that there was no damage to the blade and wonders if that girl even landed the attack. A moment later, her weapon breaks in half and falls to the ground, shocking not only the woman but all the soldiers watching the scene. The knight questions how it was possible for a sword made of the purest iron to be easily cut. Then Van takes the opportunity to explain that Kamshin's weapon was also made of the same material, but produced in a different way. As a point of comparison, the arrows from the ballista were created from the same means and were strong enough to pierce dragon shells. After shocking the Viscountess with so much information, the woman eventually gives in and decides to buy some of the arrows that the Lord produced. Later, when the villagers went to celebrate the long day of work, some men comment to Arut about how Van changed their lives. If a lovely lady like her marries the Lord of the village, then everyone would be happy and support the marriage. Seeing that this conversation was pressuring the Count's daughter, the protagonist quickly makes them step back, asking them not to disturb the guests. In that, he suggests to Arut that they could eat together alongside other people. Now that they had finished the watch around the village, the construction of the wall should be ready within a month. The area was relatively large and therefore would take some time. But compared to other cities, it usually took 3 years or more for such a large project to be completed. The difference was that in capitals they used slaves and poor workers, not having the assistance of skilled mages like Sparta. In the future, Van intended to create a certain number of walls before the merchant named Lenthalas arrived in the village. Arut asks why that is, and if it was because this man was a dangerous person. The boy smiles at her innocence, explaining that it was because he wanted to surprise him. Panamera's subordinates were all competent and quite diligent. Sparta needed a bit of time to build the fortress's foundation, and after gathering the materials, the protagonist created the ballistae for the top of each section of the wall. During dinner, Van was so exhausted that he was dragged home by his own servants. 2 weeks later, the star-shaped construction was complete. Both the common ballistae and the new ones with a different design were placed above the walls. Van was very grateful for Panamera's help, and the woman comments that she can't even count the number of times she was impressed in recent days. It was thanks to the support of the Viscountess and her subordinates that they were able to complete the defense around the village, and later the boy could focus on creating houses for merchants and adventurers. Panamera almost felt envious to see him progress so much when that had always been her personal dream as a noble. On the other hand, now that they were allies, the protagonist could always ask for help if they needed military power. Suddenly, the group hears a loud noise coming from the distance. Ortho comes running and explains that a dragon was approaching. When they looked over the walls, everyone realized it was a creature even larger and more dangerous than those they faced in the past. For now, the adventurers decide to act as bait to buy time, while the civilians return inside the fortress. Van immediately worries that Ortho and the others might put themselves in danger like that. They could face that enormous creature, but finding victory would be a different matter. At this rate, it wouldn't be long before the villagers and other knights ended up being victims of the attack. Seeing that the soldiers were ready to receive commands and engage in combat, Panamera says she would help. Then, Van asks Ortho to lead the dragon in their direction because they would use the ballistae to confront it. The others should prepare for battle and climb the walls. As soon as the adventurers return, they should open the gates to bring them in safely. Panamera warns that being a forest dragon, that enemy would be capable of shooting medium-range fire blasts. Other soldiers should escort Arit into the village and bring her 10 subordinates who could help in the fight. From the expression on the Count's daughter's face, it was clear that the girl was scared in this tense situation. To comfort her, Van mentions that although that creature is a powerful opponent, they were prepared to defend themselves. Moreover, they had a reliable ally to help them in their quest for victory, so there was nothing to worry about. Arut agrees and says she would pray for everyone to come out alive from the clash. Till is responsible for taking the girl into the village, and Van finally focuses on the dragon. He warns not to close the gates yet, as Ortho and the others were approaching. A flying opponent would be a grand threat if it got close enough to fly over the village. Therefore, the first thing they would do is target its wings. In the midst of the chaos, Puriel stumbles and falls, asking her friends to keep running and leave her behind. Instead of abandoning her, Ortho draws the dragon's attention by banging his sword against his shield. However, the creature ignores him, and Kusara says they shouldn't give up yet. As a result, the monster ended up going after him, and the others took the chance to run away. Kusara was the fastest, and Ortho believed his friend would be able to survive while they got Puriel to safety. Van watches this chaos and wonders if those idiots are playing tag in the middle of such a dangerous situation. In any case, the boy tells those at the ballistae to prepare to fire. They couldn't let Kusara be devoured, and Panamera asks to take the lead. She was ready to take down the monster with just one shot. The Viscountess had been promoted to a high-ranking knight due to the strength and recognition she gained from experiences in other battles. Her magical characteristics, as Van expected, were incredible. Without a doubt, this woman was a supreme class mage who wielded the power of the 4 elements. After conjuring a shot, Panamera sends a fire spell toward the dragon. With little difficulty, the creature dodges the attack and focuses its attention on the wall this time. With that, the ballistae get the chance to send several arrows flying at its wings. The dragon's eyes were good enough to avoid many of the shots, but not all. At this rate, they would be able to slow down the opponent's body and then get rid of its legs as well. Van doesn't ask them to prepare for the second barrage, and they should fire as soon as they are ready. However, the second attempt to bring down the dragon caused no damage as the creature dodged the attacks. Ortho and the others managed to reach the gate safely, relieved to be alive. It was the perfect moment because they had been holding back the firepower while the adventurers were within range of the shots. Soon, Panamera prepares to buy time with more of her magic while the others evacuate to the village. This time, the flame spell hits the creature squarely, creating a whirlwind of fire. Van wonders if this was the great potential that came from a high-class mage. If the opponent weren't a dragon, that attack would have had a terrifying result, but it must have been effective enough. Jumping off the wall, Panamera says she would go to the village first to prepare the counterattack. Everyone runs out of the walls, and as the wounded dragon climbs the stone walls. Now that its wings were hurt, the monster could only run. Van was confident he could handle it after they had taken down several of the other race that had scales. At the same time, seeing it up close made the protagonist feel that this threat was different. Dee decides to stay behind to draw the invader, and the protagonist immediately opposes the idea as it wasn't an opponent one could withstand alone. The guy didn't take a second to accept the Lord's request and ran ahead of everyone to reach the village, where they would prepare for battle. On the other hand, Esparta did not back down and began to walk calmly toward the dragon, and this time Van refuses to evacuate if the butler doesn't accompany him. Esparta uses magic to catch the dragon by surprise and buy time. However, the old man walks so slowly that the protagonist almost has to push him to hurry up. Kamshin asks the Lord to lead the soldiers and protect the civilians, while she would stay behind to help the butler. It would be difficult to rush back to the village even while running at high speed. Ortho and the others reached their limit and were out of breath. In this situation, Van didn't know what to do. Suddenly, Panamera shouts for the protagonist to know they were ready to fire the next attacks. At first, the boy intended to wait for her orders, but the Viscountess didn't plan to shoot without confirmation from her ally first. So, Van says that if the dragon reaches the fort, they should hold it using her flame magic first to stop it from moving, and then they would use the ballistae. The woman laughs, enjoying herself as it would be the first time she used her own abilities to stop an opponent. It doesn't take long for the creature to emerge from the debris created by Esparta, and everyone goes on high alert. Until the knight was ready to use the spell, Van had to protect his subordinates. As soon as he thought about it, Dee and the other knights ran out to fight. At that moment, the boy worried they could handle a monster like that, but the men believed they could withstand attacks using the new equipment. The knights skillfully wielded their swords and struck the dragon's body with critical hits. Asparta used magic once again to buy time, allowing the group that was bait to retreat. Van wondered if Dee's soldiers were superhuman for having such vigor and resilience. With luck, they managed to buy enough time, and Panamera was ready to unleash her magical attack. The flames hit the monster's body, and then Van gave the order for the ballistae to fire as well. Although the dragon was able to dodge most of them as before, they still managed to inflict significant damage to its body. Even more arrows struck it, exhausting all the stock they had available on the walls. Even heavily injured, the creature was still able to protect its own head. That dragon received a fatal wound and would soon die. While the subordinates on the walls reloaded the ballistae, Dee approached to check the opponent's state. As soon as the monster saw the human approach, it opened its mouth to try to bite him, but the knight immediately avoided the trap. Then, the vice commander brandished his sword and finished off the creature. The protagonist let out a sigh of relief and announced to everyone that they had achieved victory. Several shots rang out into the sky in celebration. Till and Arid appeared running a little later to check if the protagonist was okay. The boy was just a bit tired from running, but was not injured. He was taken to sit down and drink something, relaxing after so much tension. Panamera appeared to praise Van's commands earlier and commended him for being so precise. Imagining that a dragon like that would appear to destroy the village seemed like something out of Tales. On the other hand, the protagonist couldn't imagine how he would have been able to win the battle without the support of the Viscountess, Asparta, and Dee. In the worst-case scenario, the monster could have destroyed half the village, and hundreds of lives would have been lost. It was certain that everyone who contributed to the victory would be remembered as heroes by the villagers, and Van agreed that the subordinates should be proud of themselves for putting themselves at risk to save those people's lives. Seeing that the protagonist was downplaying his own importance, Panamera reminded him that it was only thanks to the command of the ballistae that they brought down the dragon. This situation made him believe he would need to increase the firepower to at least 10 shots at once to have a greater effect. The Viscountess said they could discuss it later. For now, they should celebrate the achievement they had. Dee should receive the title of Dragon Hunter, and Van that of Military Chief, along with Asparta, who participated in the collaboration. Later, the Lord gave a speech about the victory they had in defeating the forest dragon, and would pay tribute to those who contributed. The one responsible for managing the rewards would be Panamera. The woman announced that everyone who helped in the fight included both knights and mages. Successfully, they dealt with the threats that could have potentially swept away many lives. The only losses they had were 2 ballistae and a few damaged parts of the fortress. Therefore, they would start with the honorary mentions and the celebrations. The first to receive credit was Dee, the one who took the dragon's head and faced it directly alongside 2 other knights. Next, the mage Asparta was called forward to be praised for his impeccable handling of magic. Finally, Van's name was called, and all the villagers cheered loudly. Panamera couldn't help but shower him with praise and mention each of his deeds during the battle as a good leader. The protagonist felt embarrassed to receive so much attention and merely waved in thanks, feeling he had become an idol. After that embarrassing ceremony ended, the soldiers were tasked with collecting materials from the body of the creature they had defeated. To Panamera's surprise, the hunting knife he was using was quite sharp, and Van mentioned it was made with the same standard iron as the swords. The Viscountess couldn't believe he was capable of making hundreds of weapons of such quality by himself. Proudly, the Lord replied that he could give one to Panamera, but it would cost 5 gold coins. Thanks to her support and the hundreds of subordinates, they were able to quickly collect every valuable part of the dragon. The warehouse became overloaded, and Van needed to create more storage. The constructions were only half complete when the merchants returned to the village with the sales caravan. As soon as Lango arrived, he anxiously questioned his brother about the enormous fortress that hadn't been there 2 weeks before. Bell completely ignores his questions and changes the subject to something more important. The traveling merchant tells that he managed to get the support of the head of the merchant guild, and they sent 5 large caravans and 3 medium ones. The mercenaries were escorted by 4 other guards besides Lango and received help from some people and 5 slaves. Van was impressed that so many people had been gathered and guides the group to the warehouse. As soon as they learned about the latest hunt, all the sellers were shocked to have actually obtained materials made from dragons. They would be taking the scales, claws, fangs, eyes, and magical stones that could be sold for enormous amounts in the royal capital. The protagonist is shocked to hear that they could practically get 10 billion yen for all of this at an auction. At the auction, several rare items appeared, and the merchant guild always had an interest in attending to evaluate them. The Lord imagines that there must be transportation and sales costs, so he wonders if Bell and Rango could achieve a reasonable profit. At this, One of the brothers apologizes for worrying him and imagines that it is a lot for a child to think about. A stupid noble would blame the other side if there was no advantage. But unlike that type of person, Van was someone who wanted to help them as much as possible. That's why Belle assures that not only would the protagonist achieve a good profit from the sales, but they would also be well off receiving between 3 and 5 platinum coins. However, the boy suggests that they just needed to create a trading firm to resolve this issue. Immediately, all those merchants who came in the caravans showed that they were very interested in negotiating about it. They would love to open branches in the village, and Van is somewhat shocked that those guys were really trying to convince a child with so much effort. Even though there are few people in the village, the sellers were good at buying and selling and would handle the negotiations in the best possible way. At first, they intended to buy the dragon materials for 80 coins and would resell them for 100. The conversation continued, but Van was sure that those people's interest in the village would decrease as soon as the rare items were gone. None of them had any attachment to the place or the residence, so the focus was entirely on sales. That's why the boy decided to respond that he would think about the negotiations. Although the merchants tried to argue that they would certainly sell the items well, Van retorts that they could very well manipulate the prices of the materials. 80 platinum was the correct price, and even Lango agreed that it was quite a high value since they could resell for 100 coins. And of course, all the men from the caravan protested because they wanted to raise the prices even more during the auctions. Realizing that this conversation was going to turn into a discussion, Belle asks everyone to calm down. The point was that the cost of sale and escort must be taken into consideration. In the end, they would be making a profit one way or another. Besides, the basic skill for a merchant was to identify and select the best routes to escape from bandits, so any reckless behavior was not appropriate. All of this only made the men furious for being reprimanded by a young person. One of them mentions that in a year, almost no one went to that village, and if they could close a deal with Van, they would be able to make much more money than usual. Even though they were trying to buy his silence, Belle refuses to get involved in dishonest practices. A merchant's greatest weapon was trust, and no matter what happened, he never intended to do anything without showing sincerity to the customer. This young man's mentality continues to infuriate the others, who threaten him if they were reported to the guild for trying to get better business opportunities. Van listens to this entire conversation, completely shocked that these men are so indiscreet. Since he came from a noble family, the boy had always heard good stories about the Mayari merchants. However, he just discovered that they were the type of group that would take advantage if they were negotiating with a child. The Lord asks the brothers if they really don't mind ending up losing a platinum coin, and they agree. After all, the Mayari caravan didn't even know which merchant group those two belonged to and never wanted to get involved in dirty practices. They were not interested in becoming members of such a group, so they preferred to opt for independent negotiations. By hiring an escort, Lango would be able to safely take the items to the capital and would register each of the materials with the guild before the auction. The first requirement to participate in the audition was to support the nobility. The second was to own a shop, and finally, they had to lend large sums of money for the negotiations. 2 of the conditions wouldn't be a problem, but there was a rule related to the noble companies where they have absolute legal rights. Besides, each of those from the upper class would always prioritize enormous benefits over any quality. Van asks how much it would cost to sell the dragon or how much they thought they could get in percentage. This question leaves Belle curious, because it almost seemed like the boy intended to accompany them. In fact, a sales service fee was required, and the amount varied according to the market price. Knowing that the value could be high, Van questions which noble was working with the Mary group. The brothers freeze before answering that they were affiliated with the ruler of the country, the Berlinese. And now the protagonist understands perfectly how their situation became dire for having disagreed with these merchants. Since a company was established, there would be nobles interested in them to recommend to other nobles of even higher classes. If they could treat customers well, they would be able to improve the public image and gain even more support. But discovering that there was a group receiving benefits from royalty was practically dishonest. The Mayari Corporation has stores in the best locations in the country, and knights managed to sell rare materials and slaves they acquired. The first leader of the group, Mary Triumph, was known as the woman of an ancestral king. In other words, they were receiving sponsorship because a member of royalty was already linked to the main control of the company. Other companies always kept an eye on them, waiting for the best opportunity to bring them down with some exposure. The protagonist asks if the merchant guild has connections with organizations from other countries, and who knows, they might negotiate with them. Belle agrees, and thanks to that, they would be able to stabilize the store there in the village and wouldn't have money problems. In this case, the only problem left to solve was the recommendation coming from a noble, and obviously, they couldn't count on the Ferdio family. Van's father clearly hated him, and despite loving Mersha, he held no importance in the upper class. However, who knows? Panamera might be able to help as the only ally they had at the moment. Hearing about this makes the brothers so happy they could cry. At the same time, Van feels that the news he would give to the Viscountess might be bad. However, the woman didn't hesitate to agree to help them. An honorable noble like her wouldn't lose anything by supporting two small companies, but they could cause instability in the royalties if they put too much pressure on them. Panamera had no lands or a knight order at her disposal, so if she wanted to rise further in the upper class, she would have to attract the attention of the commoners. The current situation could come in handy because after defeating the dragon, making a triumphant return to the royal capital with its head and presenting it to the palace would be great for their reputation. Van agrees, realizing that no other remote village would be prepared to defeat a monster of this size. The situation was good for their side, and as soon as Panamera could take the credit for the victory for herself, the Ferdio family wouldn't bother the protagonist. But his expectations wilt as the Viscountess explains that it would be very suspicious for her to arrive claiming victory without any losses. The situation was getting worse, and the boy's fear of being forced to return home as soon as Japal learned of his son's actions only increases. The Viscountess laughs upon seeing him so worried, but she should have expected this reaction from a child. If she had the chance, she would even teach him a method to avoid being involved in this whole mess. The protagonist is curious to know what kind of idea Panamera had. However, he freezes as soon as he hears that it involved making Van officially a noble and gaining independence from his own family. That was quite a suggestion because the woman said it as if it were the easiest thing in the world. Van always gets nervous when they mention the achievements he had throughout his time in the village, but Panamera makes a point of reminding him of them. Deep down, the boy didn't feel confident about ascending to the upper class. There was no way to know what his father would do. Plus, his older brothers would be furious and would try to kill him to prevent him from stealing the heir position. Moreover, he wouldn't want to hinder Mersha's path either, so the protagonist wanted to continue seeing himself as nothing special. But even so, the Viscountess asserts that a young 8-year-old subduing a dragon would certainly attract a lot of attention, and they could use such an achievement. This way, he would acquire a lot of money and support. It was nothing but advantages for their side. Still, Panamera manages to understand where all of Van's fear was coming from. After all, she herself gained numerous enemies when she ascended from knight to noble, and there were those who tried to manipulate her as well. But the woman didn't hesitate even twice before taking out everyone who got in her way. That was why she believed Van should do the same, shooting with the ballistas he created at the face of every opponent who underestimated him. The protagonist retorts that receiving all the credit would mean his ally would get nothing in return. Panamera makes a scary face upon seeing him worry, laughing at that childish innocence, and the boy simply accepts that she was right, without questioning. At that moment, Van almost becomes concerned for himself at the possibility of that Viscountess trying to devour him with her wolf-like gaze, and that makes her laugh, this time more softly, as she promises she wouldn't do anything to him for 5 years, because she would love to see him grow and become someone important. 2 days later, Van's negotiations with the merchant brothers were a success. The conditions Panamera offered were the same as what could be achieved by sharing in a business. As soon as Lango returns to the capital, they would sell the remains of the forest dragon and that armored one. In the meantime, Belle was shocked to discover that everyone who came in caravans had quickly left. Panamera laughs because that pathetic group should be in tears after missing a great opportunity to receive benefits. For now, Van says they should focus on loading the carriages they had with the dragon materials, and everything should be fine as long as Ortho escorts them on the journey. However, the Viscountess replies that she would bring her own army to accompany them to the big city. In that case, there would be no need to worry about bandits or any other problems on the way. The protagonist breaks into a huge smile upon hearing this and thanks her, relieved to have someone so important and strong by their side. Seeing him like this makes Panamera embarrassed, pretending she doesn't care at all about the compliments. Van can hardly believe he managed to make her feel this way and is in shock. Back to the main topic, the Lord decided they would hold a festival that day with everyone so they could celebrate everything they received, sold, and acquired. Belle asks if it would really be okay to do this now that they were full of preparations to make for the journey, and the protagonist assures him that everything is fine because he has already sorted everything out by magically creating a massive carriage made of wooden blocks. Panamera is pleased because they could pull it with military horses, which were strong enough to bear all the weight. Meanwhile, the caravan makes the journey back to the capital, and the group of merchants talks. They doubt that an 8-year-old boy could do anything to hinder them. Besides, they alone wouldn't be able to find a suitable place to sell the dragon materials. There were no carriages or other teams that would help Van without asking the Mary first, and eventually, that stupid lord would realize how foolish he was to underestimate them. Suddenly, the coachmen shout when they see something strange happening. It was a carriage rushing past them, startling the merchants as they believed it was the knights. They wonder if the protagonist sent them there to arrest them for the illegal dealings they tried to make. However, they soon realize it is not the royal cavalry, but rather the men of Viscountess Panamera passing by at high speed. With them was Lango, who was happily guiding the colossal carriage alongside all the soldiers, keeping them safe. The merchants can hardly believe they are seeing with their own eyes the rising star of the nobility. It was strange that Panamera was walking with Bell and Lango, so the men of the caravan are left confused about what was happening. At this rate, not only would the efforts to make the journey there be wasted, but they would also suffer a great loss. The condition they closed with the merchant guild to get a carriage to travel to the village was to return with more than 40 valuable items. Returning empty-handed would likely cause them to drop in the seller rank and be looked down upon by the leader. The merchants consider that they could lie to the guildmaster, saying that Bell and Lango stole what they had by tricking them. Although it wasn't the best plan in the world, they at least hope it would be enough to save them from a mess. Dino Enshora Bellinet was the king of the Scuderia Kingdom, ascending to power at 16 and successfully revolutionizing the military area by the age of 20. He prevented betrayals, did not prioritize relatives, removed commanders, and changed all officials below the rank of vice commander into real warriors. Winning through the demonstration of strength was how he reigned. The rebellion that would later occur took time and considerable effort, bringing much bloodshed and loss of life. Since being born a noble, one would have the immediate chance to become an officer or vice commander. As a result, families like that of Count Ferdinand sank in power, while others like that of Marquis Fertio rose to military might. That said, the king personally offered the noble position to Panamera as one recognized for her competence. Her family had been of a generation of knights and therefore was born in the capital. Upon discovering she was compatible with magic, she immediately inherited the lands of a count and trained day and night, sacrificing nights to study and learn, until she was finally able to become the captain of a small team of soldiers at the age of 16. Then, she began to conquer various things and joined the war against the Iranetta kingdom, where she later officially ascended to nobility. The ruler was pleased with everything Panamera had done and guaranteed her the title of Viscountess within just 6 years of service. To be honest, Dino thought the knight deserved a much better reward than that, but upon hearing her say she would like to pass the gift to someone else, he became curious to know the reason. Above all, he wanted to know where the individual was that Panamera wished to hand over the position she had earned. The Viscountess explained that it was one of the feudal lords of the kingdom who had been unable to find a substitute and didn't even have a representative to be in the throne room now. The reason she chose him was for the sake of his future and all the hidden potential within him that could bring even more significant achievements. Dino was surprised that a tough military woman was showing respect and praise to another. The more interested he became in this feudal lord, the more he suspected, and thus the king wanted to understand what exactly this unknown man had done without subordinates. Without hesitation, Panamera replied that it was the subjugation of a dragon. Everyone in the room immediately commented among themselves how impressive that was, wondering if an elemental prodigy had emerged so far away. The Viscountess denied it, explaining that the lord was incompatible with the 4 types of magic to the point that his own family had exiled him from home. Dino questioned who exactly this individual was, and the woman revealed it was Van Nay Fertio, the Marquise's son, who was merely 8 years old. The ruler was confused because Jalpa had reported nothing until now, and Panamera agreed that was the case, but confirmed the event with Van and the villagers under his care. It was a poor village with almost 100 residents that had always been a target for bandits, but the arrival of that young man changed all that within a short 3 months. After reinforcing the area with large stone walls, he was able to repair the broken houses and prepare a better quality of life for the villagers. All Van had in hand was that 100 of common people, along with a few subordinates like some knights, an old wizard, and 5 adventurers. With so little, the feudal lord was able to defeat the dragon of the forest without losing anyone. The king's advisor agreed it was impressive, but at the same time, it was hard to believe that something like that could be real. Panamera stated they brought materials from that hunted creature along with some remains of a scaled dragon. Noticing that the throne room had turned into a gossip mess, the Viscountess sighed as she didn't think she would be able to convince the king with such an intense audience. Although the advisor tried to make the king reflect on how strange it was for the Viscountess to act this way, there was not much to do now but continue the interrogation. Therefore, Dino questioned about the land Van received and stated that as long as the boy was present during the inspection that would happen in a few days, everything should be fine. If everything was proven to be a lie or some kind of obscure plan, Panamera would have her rank confiscated and would be punished. The woman replied she was perfectly aware of everything and humbly asked the king to guarantee her presence in the future. After all, she herself was interested in knowing how much more Van would be able to achieve if not limited to a small village. The thought made her fear that the wise ruler might end up gifting the feudal lord with new lands to defend, given how reliable that young man seemed. Realizing that Panamera was raising expectations so high, Dino decided to take her bait and meet the protagonist personally. In the big city, everyone who saw the carriage carrying the dragon's head was astonished. Panamera appeared shortly after to announce to Belle that Van was officially a baron now, and the rewards for hunting that monster would be decided later. The people around who heard about the news whispered among themselves about the Marquis's son and the famous Prodigy, spreading the gossip. The Viscountess said it was time for the merchant brothers to go negotiate with the guild and asked what the name of the store they intended to open would be. Lango proudly replied that it would be called Lango's Business. This animated response leaves Panamera confused about how he simply decided to take all the credit for himself without a second thought. The next day, the new company created by the brothers and rumors about the protagonist becoming a noble were the most talked about news throughout the royal capital. Van was hailed as the hero capable of defeating a dragon by some unknown means, being a young and strong swordsman who decapitated the creature and claimed victory. Obviously, these were quite exaggerated rumors, and the contributions of the Viscountess ended up being overshadowed as well. But it wasn't as if it mattered much. Things would continue to be interesting for the future thanks to her, so Panamera hopes to receive plenty of gratitude from Van. Her team left the village about a month and a half ago. Meanwhile, the protagonist worked on dozens of new ballistae, and since there were only 100 people living there, they wouldn't even have the chance to use them all. The mansion where the boy lived also became quite fancy, moving to the center of the village for flexibility and better location. In addition to all this, they also managed to build 2 new enormous towers. Kamshin particularly liked the Oringo Tower for being able to see the streets from above. Till preferred the other one, called Budu, which allowed him to see the lake in the distance. D appears during the conversation to say that he would like to climb the towers to train. Upon hearing this, the 2 knights accompanying him immediately run off to save themselves from such a great torture nicknamed training. Van himself had difficulties climbing the tower stairs because it took him almost 10 minutes to reach the top. On the other hand, Kamshin was full of energy and dashed up the steps. The protagonist acknowledges that the maid was also tough to endure walking so much. In the end, the 3 of them reached the top to admire the view. Seeing the landscape makes Van feel like he was exaggerating a bit with the constructions in a place where only 100 people lived. However, considering the situation, they could no longer call the place a village and it would become a town. Having rejected the suggestion of the name Van's Village, he still heard some villagers calling the village that way, which made the boy nervous. Suddenly, Kamshin points to something in the distance, across the fields. Her eyesight was very good, but unfortunately, the protagonist wasn't that impressive, so he couldn't tell what was approaching. They didn't seem to be soldiers or adventurers, as there were various children and old people, as well as slaves. Putting aside Kamshin's unbelievably good eyesight, Van decides to descend the tower to check who the unusual visitors approaching were. On the way down, the trio encounters Arut, who came to greet them with her usual cute face. While Panamera withdrew to the royal capital, that girl stayed and lived with them since then. Esparta even took it upon himself to give her lessons in his free time. As time passed, Van stopped calling her by the title and opted to be polite, but less informal. Arut was still a child, and for that reason, the protagonist hadn't developed any feelings for her other than paternal affection. That's why sometimes he found himself petting her head, completely embarrassing the poor count's daughter, who always had cute reactions. It had been some time since Arit started to be able to converse a bit more, even if it was about simple and even silly topics. This time she came to comment on the arrival of those visitors and asked what they should do. The protagonist replies that he would take care of things and they could talk in the mansion. Kamshin was tasked with calling D back from training, and Esparta should accompany them as well since Ortho's team had gone to the forest in the morning. Seeing that as soon as she received the task, the girl ran off with great vigor, Van was impressed as usual. In fact, Kamshin had been training with D on her own, and although she didn't realize it, she was gradually becoming a good swordsman. It was clear that Knights Lu and Ab saw him as a rival amidst all this chaos. Even Arut was amazed by Kamshin's efforts. Immediately, the protagonist realizes that in any world, the most popular children were always the fastest and most athletic. Anyway, the whole group gathers at the mansion, and Esparta soon reports that the visitors came from another village to talk. At first, the representative would enter the meeting room to start the dialogue. Then an old man appeared and immediately asked if he had arrived at the village of Seat, leaving Van confused about what he was talking about. The butler explains that there used to live in that village a person named Seat, and the name of this individual marked the place, so they began to call it that. Van is left disbelieving that the village has always had a name all this time and was deceived by the villagers. Deciding to simply accept the situation, the protagonist invites the old man to sit down and ask what he would like to discuss. After having some difficulty getting the elder to listen to him due to his speaking difficulties, he apologizes and explains that they came from a neighboring village. There weren't many young people there, yet they still had to pay the same fees to live. Since they couldn't move far away, they considered relocating to the village of Seat. Van reflects that migration would be quite complicated, curious about why there were so few young people. The elder explains that the next generation did not leave their hometown of their own accord. In fact, everyone was forced to become soldiers. Without any means of defense, they could do nothing but accept the situation, even though they had shown no concern for the elders. It doesn't take long for Van to understand that it was all the fault of Count Ferdinand, who was always neglecting the people under his care. The reason the people of that poor village chose to ask Van for help instead of going to the big city was due to their fear of Ferdinand's wrath. If the Count was a cautious man, then he would not accept these people's decision, and the protagonist knew that receiving them would indirectly challenge that noble's will. It was a complicated situation, but those fragile people risked their lives to get there. Van would have liked to continue staying away from the Ferdio family's conflicts, but if it meant not extending a hand to those in need, then the answer he would give was obvious. The protagonist decides that he would welcome those people and did not intend to tax them for now, as they had enough food and shelter. According to the elder, only 13 of them traveled there, but there were 300 residents in the neighboring village. Faced with that large number, Van decides that he would offer only one house per family. The boy's kindness leaves the representative surprised, and he even starts to offer one of his granddaughters in marriage if it would be of interest. The proposal is immediately declined, with Van wondering what the problem was with this world always offering their own descendants as commodities. This kind of attitude would be unacceptable in modern Japan. Putting that topic aside, the protagonist says they would lend some carriages to bring them. However, the elder declines the offer because they had cows in the neighboring village and could use them to travel. Van becomes interested upon discovering that those residents possessed animals that produced food. And above all, they were different from those he knew from Earth, as the cows could reproduce quickly every year. Excited, the protagonist asks them to bring all of them under Ortho's escort. As that old man was the village chief, he was invited to rest and eat. However, to Van's surprise, the representative reveals he is not the true leader. A little later, the visitors were amazed by the place where they would spend the night. It was a large and quite fancy building compared to the houses they were used to living in. Although the protagonist maintains a serious expression while hearing all this, inside he feels proud to surprise the people. He invites them to enter the hotel so they can enjoy a good meal and spend the night. Additionally, he asks Till and Kamshin to help guide the immigrants and show them the rooms. Arut approaches and curiously questions what they would do about these people. Belatedly, Van remembers that the girl was precisely the Count's daughter, whom they were challenging the order. So, instead of telling the truth, he explains that they were a passing people who would stay there for now. The boy's decision makes Arut happy, hoping that those people could find safety in the village. It has been 2 months since she moved there with Van, and the protagonist is interested to know if she intends to stay there forever. Although a bit shy, the Count's daughter agrees that she would be happy if it were possible. Since they were both children, they could forget the marriage proposal. In that case, Van hopes Arut decides what she wants to do with her own life from now on. On the other hand, after reflecting in silence for a moment, the girl says she would like to marry him. Upon realizing what she had just said, Arut turns red with embarrassment, and the protagonist remembers that a gentleman like Van would never embarrass a lady like that. So he again proposes that they forget about all this for now. Despite everything, a part of him is a little happy to know that he has become popular. Later, Ortho and his team return from the forest, and the protagonist takes the opportunity to greet them. When he turns to speak to them, the boy is startled to see that the adventurers are covered in blood. Ortho apologizes for this, explaining that they found the entrance to the dungeon. Van is initially confused about what they were talking about, but gradually remembers that they had discussed this before. Esparta interrupts the feudal lord's shock and states that they should report the encounter with the dungeon to the capital. Otherwise, Japal would take advantage of the situation to seize it from Van. The protagonist reflects on the possibility of creating an adventurers guild in the future in the village, along with other interesting constructions like a host club and casinos. Although Ortho apologizes to the protagonist for the situation, the boy is not upset and decides they will do as the butler suggested. However, the only one who would make the trip to the capital to report about the dungeon would be Kusara. Van could bet it was him who accidentally discovered the dungeon, considering how energetic and noisy he was. The reason for asking Kusara to go alone was that he needed Ortho and the others to escort some villagers from another village. The reward would be a large gold coin, and immediately the adventurers agreed to do what Van asked, ignoring their colleagues' protests. Noticing that Kusara looked down for being left alone, the protagonist gifts him a mithril dagger. It was enough to buy the man's happiness, to the point that Ortho and the others fought to switch places with their colleague. After the commotion, they finally separated to fulfill their respective tasks. During the journey, Kusara hums happily to himself for having such an amazing lord. It wouldn't be long before he reached his destination, or so he thought until he found a destroyed carriage on the ground. Next to it, some orcs were aggressively eating the horse's body. Kusara comes into focus as soon as he realizes this, and remembers that this was a type of monster that always remains loyal to its own desires, which means that the person inside the carriage would end up with a terrible fate at the hands of these creatures. It would be quite difficult to defeat them, but the adventurer did not intend to abandon someone in danger. Taking advantage of the two distracted orcs, he approaches and attacks them, killing two of them at once. The others turn their attention to the adventurer, who does not hesitate to finish each of them off with the new mithril dagger he received from Van. As expected, it was an impressive and super sharp weapon. After defeating all the monsters, a girl descends from the carriage upon realizing that the battle has ended. She expresses gratitude to the adventurer for saving her, and introduces herself as Furamilia Strast. At first, the lady assumes that Kusara is someone of high status, and asks for his identity. Nervously, the young man explains that he was just passing through and ended up finding this situation, but he was not someone famous or anything like that. Furamilia asks why he is hiding the truth since she can see how Kusara is wearing expensive clothes and weapons. Regardless, the girl still intends to continue her journey to the royal capital, even if it means walking. For now, she has no way to pay the adventurer for saving her life, and asks if she can postpone the reward for another day. Kusara mentions that he is going to the same place, and can offer her the horse he has been using until now. Although Furamilia hesitates because she doesn't want to cause more trouble, the young man insists as he doesn't want to make a lady dirty her shoes or tire herself out. The way she was addressed makes her laugh, because it has been a long time since someone treated her that way. After all, she is now 30 years old. Kusara just laughs at those words, not believing they were true, and changes the subject, wanting to know exactly where the young woman intends to go. At that moment, Furamilia realizes that the escort that was supposed to accompany her has fled. Her father, a viscount, died in battle, and both the house she lived in and the name she had fell into disgrace. So she was looking for work as a maid. This was a problematic situation, and even makes her feel bad for venting all this to a stranger. However, Kusara smiles upon seeing that Furamilia has become a freelancer, and in that case, they are on the same level. He tells her that he is living in a nearby village and she could follow him if she wants, as they would certainly be able to find a task that she can adapt to. In light of such kindness, Furamilia smiles and expresses her gratitude. Later, at the Adventurers Guild, Kusara reported about the dungeon discovered near the lands of Marquis Fertio. It didn't take long for the news to spread, and for people to find out it was the same place where they had subdued a forest dragon. The guild would make preparations immediately to set up a branch in the village. Additionally, they would be buying any materials they could with a 20% increase in value. In addition, anyone who is able to map the dungeon would be recognized and rewarded. Several adventurers surround Kusara, wanting more information and talking so much that it irritates him. As a result, he had to take Furamilia's hand and run to avoid getting caught up in an even greater chaos. The two spent some time in the royal capital before making the trip back to the village, bringing carriages, horses, food, and clothes. Furamilia feels bad for letting Kusara take care of paying for the room they stayed in and the meals, but the young man was happy to help her. The girl hadn't smiled from the bottom of her heart for some time, so she felt grateful to the adventurer. In this, the young man comments that the feudal lord of the lands where he lived was a very clever and kind child, so he could expect good things when they arrived. Meanwhile, Ortho did the escort work for the villagers from the neighboring village as well. Periel reprimands the group leader for getting distracted with conversations instead of focusing on the dangers the forest may bring. The adventurers were caught off guard when they discovered the increase in residents they had in the village, and they were even more shocked when they heard that literally everyone living in the neighborhood wanted to move. Ortho saw many people die without knowing what the world was like, so meeting a people so determined to face hunger just to find a better life was admirable. It would never be an easy task to migrate to another place and adapt. Among the people he was guiding, there was a woman who kept murmuring to herself about how she was against the plan to leave home just to go to another worse village. Ortho understands what she means since it is a village near the border, but certainly all the villagers would be surprised to see the quality of life they would have from now on, and it was exactly as the adventurer predicted, as Van and the others welcomed the immigrants with a huge party, including meals, good humor, and rest. The true chief of the village, Fabia, Spellboo, thanks the protagonist for accepting them. Van thanks Ortho for his good work in saving so many lives, and in this, Puriel becomes curious about the meat they were using for the barbecue. This time, they opted to roast what they managed to get from 10 large wild boars that appeared in the forest the other day. With little effort, the new ballistae took care of all of them. In the middle of the conversation, some children approached Van to ask if they could eat too, and Till was the first to call everyone closer to the tables and meals they had prepared enough to fill their stomachs, and many of the younger ones there had never seen so much food in their lives. Van doesn't take long to see that some of the immigrants start crying tears of joy while they eat, bringing a pleasant and warm atmosphere to the environment. It makes him quite happy to see that the efforts to create homes and a banquet sufficient to satisfy 300 people have worked. Before Ortho's escort arrived there, the protagonist gave his all to make this possible. All that would need to be done from now on is to get an estimate of the size of the surroundings of the village. The idea was to create a small town outside the walls so that adventurers could stay before and after visiting the dungeon. This way they would prevent possible crimes, and anyone suspicious of invading the proposal from the feudal lord left Ortho impressed, but the boy had not finished sharing his plans. He intends to finish the construction within a month with space for 400 people, with tall houses and floors, as well as shops and inns. The walls would be around 500 meters wide and would include 3 ballistae to defend the entrance. Esparta adds that the Adventurers Guild would soon bring a branch and suggests that they place it in this town that would be built. The butler assumes that each facility that would be created would also be under the protagonist's responsibility to have benefits, and Van agrees that this is the case, as although it would require a lot of time and work, it would be worth it. Then, Esparta mentions that it would be a good idea to consider having a representative in the new town. The idea was to get a group responsible for maintaining order, and luckily, they had D and his knights to support them, which means they would have to decide how to manage the security of each place. It was a fact that there would be those who would try to steal, and those with malicious hearts would emerge to manipulate people. Van agreed to take care of some, while Bell and Lango did the rest of the work. They would also escort adventurers to join the knights as soon as possible, and the boy hopes that Esparta can take on the role of representative. In response to the Lord's request, the butler agrees to act as manager and hire the talents he finds. D would be responsible for taking care of the soldiers from the village of Seat, and they would form a new group to look after the new city. Esparta questions whether this amount of work was revenge for the days he gave intensive lessons, and the protagonist plays dumb as if he didn't know what he was talking about. Before he could return to check on the situation at the party, Art appears and asks if he could accompany him. The protagonist agrees and suggests they could eat while walking, even if it's a breach of good manners. Till and Kamshin follow them during the walk and eventually realize they didn't have enough seats for everyone present. Then Van approaches a man and asks him to bring some chairs. Even surprised to be speaking directly with the Lord, he quickly does what was asked. In light of this, the boy thanks him for the help and comments that he would love to have him in the village's knight army they were preparing for the future. Van feels proud to have hired someone faster than Esparta and decides to call anyone who looks like a warrior. While reflecting on this, a group of immigrants appears to ask if there was anything they could help with now that they would be living there. The protagonist agrees and proposes that some take care of shops, inns, and farms they plan to create in the future. Although some of them don't mind doing the heavy work, the vast majority have never had the chance to manage a business before. Noticing their concern, Van assures them that everything would be fine as there were various types of work to be done. Moreover, they would pay each one according to the corresponding task. Rhonda also approached the immigrants to tell them how good life was there, and that at first, he thought he was living in the wrong place until the feudal lord arrived. The residents of Seat never imagined the day would come when they would live smiling and have the chance to enjoy leisure. Therefore, they hoped that the new companions who had just arrived could enjoy daily life there as much as they did. And this was just the beginning of everything. There would still be more amazing projects coming. The village was reaching a stage where they needed to start thinking not just about survival, but stability for the future. And just like that, Van announces that they would be building another city right now. Now that they were accompanied by more helpers, the village needed to prepare to welcome other people. Those who had enough strength were holding a rope marking the territory where they would build the city for adventurers. The elders were used to taking care of cows, so they were responsible for the farms. The Abgalus used to feed the animals with water and grass from time to time. The immigrant children were radiant with their new homes and always appeared running from one side to the other. Besides that, all the new residents were amazed by the huge walls. During the new construction project, Dee was very proactive in getting more wood. In the meantime, Van discovered that the vice commander was already managing to get a squad of knights on his own and didn't even need help for that from the start. When the protagonist went to talk to those men, he found out that they had all actually been hired by Sparta and even signed a contract. In other words, the Lord lost badly to the butler in the competition of who could form an army first. Despite this, Van still had Dee with him, who could be the captain, and the subordinates Ab and Lou, who could be promoted to vice. However, imagining a team of only 20 men was very little. Anyway, the protagonist allowed the two groups of men to join together on the trip to the forest to gather resources. A little later, Kamshin came to tell about the arrival of Kusara, who was approaching with several other carriages accompanying him. As soon as they saw that the adventurer was arriving in the village accompanied by a girl, Van wondered who she was. Excited about a possible romance, Till and Arit assumed that Kusara saved the mysterious lady from a dangerous situation and made her fall in love with him. Although Van wonders if things like that really happen in real life, Kamshin mentions that the adventurer was actually quite incredible. He was an agile man, capable of detecting enemies, setting and disabling traps, and besides that, his sword skills were quite unique. While the quartet gossips about the boy's popularity, Kusara himself approaches with a heavy sigh upon realizing they were talking about him. The protagonist was quick to pretend nothing happened and asks about the girl who was with him. Then, Kusara explains that he met this lady on the way, and since he had nowhere to go, he brought her to the village. Amelia takes the opportunity to introduce herself and adds that she was attacked by orcs near the capital, but was saved. Even when Kusara felt embarrassed for being praised, the girl was happy to talk about the deeds of the man who was her hero. Setting aside how much Till and Arut celebrated the romantic story, soon the huge group of adventurers approached. Instead of appearing calm like Ortho's team, the way they acted and dressed resembled more that of barbarians. Kusara apologizes for this chaos as he ended up being followed by these idiots after making the report to the guild. Van was sure that the adventurers would scare the villagers, so he presumed he would have to let them camp outside the village. On the other hand, he remembered that he needed to gain the trust of those barbarians so they could spread good things about the village. In this, the Lord asks Kusara to have them wait a bit as soon the inns would be ready. Ortho was exploring around the dungeon, but it was a rather poor spot for visitors to camp. In this case, Kusara decided he would rest for now and return to action the next day. Seeing that Amelia accompanied him, Van was sure she was a lady of nobility. Arut mentioned that he partially knew her as she was related to Count Stratz. Apparently, the head of the family had died, and gradually everything they had degraded until it reached ruin. Till was moved by the sad story of that young woman, and Arut corrected their impression by explaining that Amelia was over 30 years old. Van and Kamshin concluded that this world was indeed full of unbelievable things. In any case, the group decided to refocus on building the town, having already completed the temporary shelters and defensive walls. The idea was to create a protection that could stop at least medium-sized monsters, so the villagers would have a chance to flee if necessary. While they were talking, suddenly that scary group of adventurers approached to talk. However, instead of pushing them away, Van and the others felt they were more alerting them to possible dangers than trying to provoke them. Despite the men having a frightening appearance, they were unable to threaten the protagonist and ended up backing off with their pride hurt. On the other hand, there was a team called White Oath that was willing to talk, also trying to warn the children who were outside the village about how dangerous it was. Van thanked them for their concern and explained that they would return to the village if something happened. One of the men said he had heard that the feudal lord was a young viscount, and they were curious to know the identity of this individual full of subordinates and money. This was the first time the protagonist had heard about this noble, and he also wondered who he was. Just when another adventurer asked what the children were playing with, Van replied that they needed to collect wood, and he began to use his own creation magic in front of everyone to create a temporary fence while they were out of building materials. The group of visitors was startled by what they saw and questioned about this strange boy. Right at that moment, Dee and the other knights arrived carrying logs of wood, and the adventurers were incredulous that the child in front of them was Van. Faced with this reaction on a large scale, the vice commander drew his sword in fury for them trying to underestimate the lord of those lands. Some even tried to pick a fight with Dee, but each of them was defeated mercilessly. The name of the greatest dragon hunter spread among the Adventurers Guild following this event. Everyone was so scared that whenever they saw D randomly in the streets, they made a point of bowing and greeting him. Although the protagonist didn't think it was the best way to earn respect from those men, it should still be enough to keep them in line. Apparently, there were others who showed interest in the fact that the feudal lord was a child. Van was not ashamed to say that he was kicked out of his home because of the skills he had, and the vast majority of adventurers felt empathy for the situation. In the midst of this, Ortho became worried that they were starting a competition for the protagonist's trust. After spending some time exploring the dungeon, their team finally returned to the village. Van mentioned that Kusara was the one who brought that group of visitors and came accompanied by a beautiful lady as well. The boys' friends were incredulous that it could be true, but it didn't take long for Kusara himself to appear and find them. He explained the whole story he had with Furamilia to his companions, and said goodbye before leaving in the utmost tranquility. Meanwhile, Ortho and the others froze in shock and even wondered if they were dreaming about what they had just seen, because they never imagined that idiot Kusara with a woman. Van began to consider the idea of building a house for those two, and it became even clearer that a romance was about to blossom. As a result, the men of Kusara's team lament not having gone in place of their friend to experience the love of a lifetime. Returning to the important topic, the feudal lord asks Puriel about the dungeon. The monsters inside it did not come out, and the entrance was closed off by a cliff, so reaching the location would require a dangerous crossing. The passage was narrow enough that only 2 people at a time could enter. There were stairs leading to the first floor, as well as pillars and glowing crystals just like any dungeon. In terms of travel, it would take about an hour by carriage and 3 hours walking through the forest. Van is shocked by how far it was, and Puriel responds that this is an aspect that dungeons have in common. This makes sense considering that no one would be foolish enough to build a village near a dangerous location, but the protagonist was still considering the idea for the future. Seeing him reflect in silence, Puriel says that the surroundings of the dungeon have large monsters, and it was difficult even to set up camp nearby. For now, it would be hard to establish a base nearby, and Van realizes that the adventurer had easily read his thoughts. The boy shyly responds that he understands the forest is dangerous and that they couldn't carry the heavy ballistae there, which is why he considered creating something near the dungeon. The adventurer promises that she and her group would protect Van. After all, they had been in similar places many times. However, the Lord did not want to fall for Puriel's words, as he still wanted to remain isolated within the city as much as possible. Thus, Van begins to list everything he would need if he were to go to a dungeon, acting like a spoiled brat on purpose just to avoid accepting her proposal. Normally, this is how an 8-year-old noble child would act, demanding afternoon naps and desserts, so the boy was curious about the girl's response. To his shock, Puriel accepted the conditions without hesitation, perfectly prepared to take him to the dungeon the next day. Ignoring Van's surprised expression, the adventurer went to report to Ortho about the news. Beside them, Till, Arut, and Kamshin stared at the protagonist after hearing the whole conversation, equally amazed at the direction of the discussion. The next day, 3.5 hours after leaving the village, the expedition group set off for the dungeon. Van never imagined he would go to one, but seeing the appearance of the cliff leading to the dungeon entrance was stunning. Since they had decided to leave early, some adventurers who were camping decided to accompany them. Now, Van's group of friends traveled on a sanctuary platform made by the boy, which was surprisingly light to lift. Although it was easy not to have to walk on that road, sometimes the tremors of the journey made them feel like they could fall off that cliff at any moment. Moreover, the adventurers were all noisy, always shouting full of energy or during battles against monsters that appeared along the way. Kamshin, on the other hand, seemed to be disliking the journey due to motion sickness. Till and Arit admired the landscapes and how beautiful the distant mountains were. The two spotted a flying monster that left Van slightly worried. If they were targeted, they would become quite easy prey, although the protagonist had brought the beast with him for protection. Suddenly, a voice shouted to announce that they had arrived at the dungeon, and the Lord peeked out of the platform to see how things were ahead. However, upon realizing they would have to cross a super narrow bridge, he shouted desperately for them to stop immediately. Ortho was confused about why they had interrupted their walk, and ordered the men to take Van to the other side of the cliff. No matter how much he looked at that situation, there was nothing safe about the crossing. But considering the kind of life adventurers live, it was fair to say they usually do not think about their own safety. Regardless, the feudal lord refused to let more people cross that dangerous point. An adventurer questioned since when they had risk management like that, and the protagonist told him to kneel and reflect. Even without understanding anything, the man was forced to do so, and Van asked Kusara why he kept jumping on the narrow passage. And the boy explained that he was testing the crossing's strength so that other travelers larger or even heavier than him could pass without worry. Seeing that another foolish adventurer thought it was a good idea to just cross as it was, Van asked them to bring more wood. Immediately, the boy created a huge bridge and asked the men to always confirm the risks before passing through a location. As soon as the vast majority protested because this kind of attitude would take too long, and Van reprimanded them, the group ended up being forced to agree to the demand. In any case, the protagonist finishes the bridge and adds the base to it so that everyone can cross without worries. The entrance to the dungeon could be seen from that distance and was surrounded by other cliffs around. It would certainly be a problem to build a base inside such a tight spot. He would need to receive some suggestions for constructing the main buildings, and he decides to listen to what the adventurers had to say. As soon as the first proposal was to create a host club, Van ordered the man to kneel and rejected the idea. Dealing with those idiots only proved to be a more and more difficult task each day. In the end, the planning began with the production of a door that would lead to the dungeon. There would also be a system to pull water from the rivers, and the base would be right next to the entrance, at a point higher on the cliff that could be accessed more easily. 4 hours later, with a lot of dedication from everyone on the team, the base was ready. On the ground floor was the resting room and the stockroom. On the first floor, the nap rooms and the cafeteria. Higher up, they would find 6 sleeping rooms with several beds per room. The construction was made at the center of gravity and was quite sturdy, so the adventurers were not at risk of causing damage or falling. There were also 4 bathrooms per floor and tanks that collected rainwater on the roof, already prepared with nets for filtration, although it was not potable. Van would leave the management of the place in Ortho's hands. The two were in doubt about whether to leave the door to the dungeon open this time or not. After all, there were still adventurers who preferred to enter at night. The ideal would be to keep the entrance closed if no one was inside the dungeon, as it could be an extra security measure in case something tried to come out from there. Van prepared for such situations and made the door out of mithril, in addition to adding layers of bars so that monsters could not easily destroy them. Besides, the windows of the base were reinforced to prevent invasions by forest creatures. As soon as they realized it was getting late, the protagonist called the group to return to the village, fearing they might encounter a monster. When the adventurers were disappointed about having to leave, Van argued that Esparta would be angry if they were late. At that moment, everyone laughed at the boy because even though he was a feudal lord, he still had childish behaviors, and Van almost felt like destroying the base after the provocation. Grumbling, he ordered them to follow him or they would go without dinner. Despite the threats, the protagonist did not scare anyone and continued to make everyone laugh. Back at the travel platform, Van was still a bit grumpy when he heard some adventurers asking about the passage ahead. Apparently, there was another cliff they crossed via a super narrow bridge, and the boy hadn't noticed it until now. As a result, the Lord ended up needing to create 2 more bridges before they finally had the chance to leave the forest. Finally, they managed to return to the village as the sun began to set. At the gate, Dee and Esparta were waiting for their arrival. Seeing the butler's scary face, the protagonist was sure he would receive a big lecture. Even with the boy trying to ask anyone there to convince Esparta otherwise, no one wanted to face the old man's fury. Van went to plead with Ortho to talk to the 2 men at the entrance. Despite being equally tense, the adventurer tried to dialogue with Esparta, making the protagonist develop even more respect for him. However, the butler told him to shut up, and the protagonist was the only one to receive the full reprimand. In the end, the boy could not stop studying diligently until midnight. In parallel, at the back of the royal capital, there was a slave market. A lovely girl who could not use magic of the 4 elements would normally be required to do work like singing, dancing, and enchanting others. But women like the one who was trapped in a cell were abandoned by hunters. The more slaves left, the worse the treatment was for those who stayed behind. On a certain day, some men talked near the cells about a certain individual who bought all the slaves they had these days. All were sent to a distant point in the country, living the rest of their lives in a mine in the mountains. The imprisoned woman reflected that she would have the same fate and wondered if she would ever be able to find a purpose in life or if she would die in this circumstance. Back in the village of Seat, Van strolled through the adventurers' town and received waves from the streets. The merchant caravan had arrived with Lango leading the way. The first thing Belle imagined was receiving a warm and familiar hug. But of course, the first thing Lango asked was how much money he had made in the big city. The two celebrate when they discuss the profits of 180 platinum coins. In the process, the merchant managed to acquire carriages and horses, as well as purchase 150 healthy slaves. In total, 8 gold coins were spent on them. After the auction at the Merry Guild, the merchant tried to talk about the misunderstanding regarding the carriages, but the group itself came to apologize on their own for some reason. After having trouble negotiating with Van, they faced the consequences. As soon as the protagonist appears to greet Lango, the man immediately hands him a bag with the platinum coins he promised. The feudal lord receives it somewhat shocked and hands it to Till, who feels tense holding so much money. Additionally, the merchant gives Van 2 other coins that were his profit. From now on, the brothers were willing to pay the boy for always taking such good care of them. This makes the protagonist happy, promising that he would always sell the monster materials he acquires, especially to those two. It was a beneficial victory for both sides. In the middle of the conversation, Lango mentions that the boy has officially become a baron as well, and this surprises him. With that, it no longer matters what the head of the Ferdio family says, as they would be unable to force Van to make any decisions or threaten him. Kamshin asks about Panamera, and Lango replies that the Viscountess had to hurry to do other things as soon as she arrived in the city. She openly supported Van's group and believes that cultivating the village's lands is more interesting at the moment. The protagonist liked the woman as a person, but not as his superior, so this would be a rather complicated relationship. Seeing him in conflict, Lango explains that her idea was to acquire land near the village to establish her own city. Panamera managed to become a conqueror before Van could even keep up with her. Returning to the main topic, Lango says he would like to buy the carriage he used for travel. Although the protagonist doesn't mind gifting it since he wouldn't use it, the merchant states that it would be problematic for others to see this as a sign of favoritism. That said, the man hands another valuable item to the boy, and he again passes it to Till, who can barely contain herself holding so much money. From inside the carriage, Lango pulls out a box that contained a very special item he managed to get specifically for Van. It was the most advanced crossbow in the capital, capable of firing arrows with a much shorter interval and in an automated manner. It could be reloaded by simply removing the top part in a few seconds. Despite there being several versions of it, they managed to buy 3 of the same style and some of another model, acquiring 10 in total. Van falls in love with the gift and thanks Lango with a big hug. When testing the new crossbow, he realizes how much fun it is to make the shots. It would also serve as a reference for the protagonist's future ballistae. The others watching the scene are happy to see the feudal lord so content. Aside from the items, Lango shows that he brought the slaves he mentioned before the capital, hoping that Van could use them to cover the labor shortage. The boy hated this kind of system and truly hoped to create a world where everyone could live with a good quality of life if possible. This ideology equally applied to those people who were brought to the village against their own will. Van is curious about the apology that the Merry Association offered to a newly made baron. Bell assumes that this group must have seen great value in the protagonist to not want to keep him as an enemy. In that case, the boy reflects that he should perhaps prioritize discussing with their association when he has the opportunity to do business again. Putting that aside for now, Van approaches the slaves and introduces himself kindly. He thanks them for coming and asks them to clean the bodies and rest a bit. To prevent them from remaining exhausted and to help them calm down, they would also prepare a hot meal. The villagers welcome the slaves with a smile and do not mind at all the state they were in, offering new clothes and all the care they deserve. Our video ends here. If you liked it, leave your like. See you next time. Bye-bye.